the Hellgate of Nebraska. Good evening, or perhaps good morning, depending on where and when you choose to listen. Welcome back to the space between the lines, the shadows behind the words. This is Eli Nightfall. Tonight we travel west. Not to the dramatic coasts or the haunted peaks, but to the heartland. Nebraska, a place often painted in broad strokes of golden corn and endless blue sky. Solid, dependable, utterly, terrifyingly flat in its predictability. The kind of place where nothing truly bad is supposed to happen, where the dramas are small, contained by the vastness of the land itself. We find ourselves in Blackwater Flats. The name itself feels blunt, practical, like the people who settled it generations ago, carving lives from the unforgiving prairie soil. It's not a place that leaps from a map, just another grid of county roads, a cluster of houses around a single main street, a grain elevator piercing the sky like a lonely sentinel, and fields. Miles upon miles of fields, stretching away under a sky so immense it feels like a physical presence pressing down. Life here follows the rhythm of the seasons, the predictable cycle of planting, growing, harvesting. The concerns are tangible: rainfall, crop prices, the health of the livestock, the Friday night football game. It's a world built on the assumption of solid ground beneath your feet, until the ground isn't solid anymore. It happened without fanfare, without warning, sometime between the last slice of moon setting and the first hint of dawn painting the eastern horizon. One moment, the Henderson farm, just west of town, was 300 acres of prime Nebraska soil, corn stubble sharp under the starlight. The next, it wasn't. Old man Henderson, rising before dawn as he had for 60 years, stepped onto his porch with a steaming mug of coffee, ready to greet the day, and nearly dropped it. Where his westernmost field should have been, there was nothing. A void, a colossal, ragged wound torn in the earth, easily swallowing 50 acres, maybe more. It wasn't neat. This wasn't some geological curiosity, a polite dip in the landscape. This was violence. The edges were fractured, sharp, like shattered bone. Clods of earth the size of tractors lay strewn about. Mature trees that had stood for decades were simply gone, vanished into the depths. And the depth, that was the first truly unsettling thing. Peering over the unstable edge, which no one dare get too close to, revealed only darkness. A blackness that seemed to absorb the early morning light, giving nothing back. No bottom visible, just pit. News travels fast in a place like Blackwater Flats. Carried on phone lines, still crackling with static, passed between neighbors leaning over fences. Discussed in hushed tones at the counter of Millie's Diner. A sinkhole, that was the initial word. Biggest damn sinkhole anyone had ever seen or heard of. Sheriff Brody McLean arrived, his cruiser kicking up dust on the hastily cordoned-off access road. Brody was a man built like the land itself, solid, weathered, not prone to flights of fancy. He dealt with tornadoes, flash floods, the occasional bar fight spilling onto Main Street. He knew disaster, but this felt different. Standing near the edge, the sheer scale of it was dizzying. But it was more than the size. There was a stillness about it, an unnatural quiet. The birds seemed to avoid the airspace above it. The ever-present Nebraska wind seemed to falter, to eddy nervously around the perimeter before hurrying on its way. Geologists were called in, of course. Experts from Lincoln, driving out in their government vehicles, armed with instruments and theories about karst topography and groundwater erosion. They talked about limestone bedrock, subterranean rivers, the slow, inevitable processes of nature. Their explanations sounded reasonable, scientific. Yet, they couldn't quite meet the eyes of the townsfolk who gathered at a safe distance, staring into the abyss that had opened in their familiar world. They couldn't explain the feeling the whole gave off, a palpable sense of wrongness. Old Martha Gable, whose family had been in Blackwater Flats since the sod-busting days, she felt it strongest. Martha was the town's unofficial historian, keeper of brittle photo albums and stories passed down through generations, stories the modern world dismissed as folklore, as prairie superstition. She stood apart from the others, her gaze fixed on the pit, her knuckles white where she gripped the head of her cane. She remembered tales her grandmother told, whispers of the land before the settlers came, before the grid was imposed. Tales of places the natives avoided, places where the earth was said to be thin, places where things slept and should never, ever be disturbed. She felt a coldness radiating from the hole, a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air, a deep, ancient coldness that spoke of immemorial darkness. The geologists took measurements, set up sensors, promised reports. They used words like unprecedented and anomalous. But science seemed inadequate to capture the oppressive atmosphere settling over Blackwater Flats. It couldn't quantify the way shadows seemed to linger a little too long near the pit's edge, even in broad daylight. It couldn't explain the faint, almost subsonic hum that some claimed to hear when the wind died down, a vibration felt more in the bones than heard with the ears. It couldn't explain the sudden unease that gripped livestock miles away, the nervous shifting and lowing in the dead of night. Sheriff McLean, despite his pragmatic nature, felt it too. A prickling on the back of his neck whenever he looked towards the Henderson place. A sense of being watched, not by human eyes, but by something vast, indifferent, and patient, lurking just beyond the veil of perception, now exposed by this sudden, violent rupture in the fabric of his world. The hole wasn't just empty space. It felt like an absence, a negation of the familiar landscape, a scar. But scars sometimes fester. Sometimes they open up again. And sometimes they're gateways. The official explanation would be delivered. Geological instability. A natural, albeit dramatic, event. Case closed. But here in the heartland, under the watchful eye of that immense sky, the residents of Blackwater Flats couldn't shake the feeling that something had been unleashed. Something ancient. Something hungry. The whispers had begun, carried on that nervous wind, echoing the old tales Martha Gable remembered. Tales of the earth giving way not just to emptiness, but to something else. The first day ended with an uneasy sunset bleeding across the western sky, painting the edges of the monstrous pit in hues of orange and bruised purple. And as darkness fell, absolute and profound, over the silent fields and the gaping maw in the Henderson farm, the real question began to surface, unspoken but felt by all. What, exactly, dwells in the darkness beneath Blackwater Flats? And what happens when it starts to climb out? Chapter 1. The Scar on the Plains. The dust tasted old. Not the usual fine powder kicked up by pickup trucks on the county roads around Blackwater Flats, Nebraska. That was familiar. The taste of dry summer earth and pulverized corn husks. This dust, settling thick and gray on the dashboard of Sheriff Brody McLean's cruiser as he bumped along the rutted track leading to the Henderson place, tasted ancient, like disturbed tomb air, carrying a faint, metallic tang that coated the back of his throat. He cracked the window, hoping for a breeze, but the air outside was unnervingly still, heavy and stagnant despite the wide-open prairie sky stretching overhead, a pale, washed-out blue that seemed miles higher than usual. Even the ceaseless Nebraska wind, that constant companion whispering secrets through the corn rows and rattling the loose tin on barn roofs, seemed to have died down, holding its breath. Brody frowned, wiping a hand across his mouth. 48 years he'd lived and worked this land, 22 as sheriff, and he'd never known a silence quite like this. It wasn't peaceful. It felt predatory. Blackwater Flats wasn't much more than a crossroads, really. A huddle of buildings along Highway 6. Millie's Diner, O'Connell's Hardware, the Feed and Seed. A clapboard Lutheran church with a tilting steeple, the two-pump gas station, and the squat brick box that housed his office in the town's single-holding cell. Beyond that, houses fanned out, modest frame structures mostly, giving way quickly to the vast, checkerboard expanse of farmland that defined their existence. Life here was measured in acres and bushels, dictated by weather patterns and a relentless cycle of seasons. People were generally self-reliant, neighborly, but not overly nosy. grounded in a pragmatism born from generations of wrestling a living from the soil. They dealt with tornadoes, droughts, blizzards, things they could understand, however devastating. This was different. He crested the low rise that normally offered a panoramic view of Jed Henderson's meticulously kept fields, the neat rows of corn stretching towards the hazy horizon. Brody braked, the cruiser fishtailing slightly in the loose dirt. The view wasn't there anymore. Where the westernmost 80 acres should have been, there was only a ragged, gaping void. The scale of it was staggering, far worse than the frantic early morning calls had conveyed. It looked less like a sinkhole and more like the earth had been violently torn open, ripped apart by some impossible force. The edges weren't smooth slopes, but jagged escarpments of fractured soil and rock, dropping away into a darkness so profound it seemed to swallow the morning light. Clumps of earth the size of small cars lay scattered around the perimeter, testament to the unbelievable violence of the collapse. Mature cottonwoods that had lined the field boundary were simply gone, vanished into the chasm. Brody felt a lurch in his stomach that had nothing to do with the bumpy ride. Old man Henderson himself stood near a hastily erected barrier of sawhorses and yellow caution tape that Brody's deputy, Miller, must have put up. Henderson was a statue carved from shock, his face gray, his eyes fixed on the abyss that had devoured a significant portion of his livelihood, and, it seemed, his grasp on reality. Miller, young, eager, and clearly out of his depth, stood beside him, shifting his weight nervously. A handful of other neighbors had gathered too, keeping a respectful distance, their faces a mixture of awe, fear, and morbid curiosity. No one spoke. The silence pressed in, broken only by the occasional crunch of gravel underfoot in the distant. Frantic barking of Henderson's dogs, locked securely in their kennel near the farmhouse. They at least seemed to retain some instinctual wisdom about staying away. Brody got out of the cruiser, the unnatural stillness immediately prickling the hairs on the back of his neck. He walked towards Henderson, his boots sinking slightly into the strange gray dust. "Jed," he said, his voice sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet. "You all right?" Henderson didn't look at him. His gaze remained locked on the pit. It just opened up, Brody," he whispered, his voice raspy. "Middle of the night. Didn't hear a thing. Just woke up and it was there. Took the corn. Took the trees. Took the goddamn earth." Brody looked out over the chasm. He'd seen sinkholes before. Smaller ones, usually near the creek beds after heavy rains. This was orders of magnitude larger, and the feeling it emanated was utterly alien. It wasn't just the size or the depth, though estimating that depth was impossible. The darkness within seemed absolute. It was the wrongness of it. The air felt colder near the edge, carrying that faint metallic tang and something else, a faint, almost organic scent of decay, but deeper, stonier. He scanned the jagged rim. No signs of water erosion. No obvious geological strata suggesting a simple collapse. It looked like something had punched through from below, or perhaps pulled the land down from an impossible depth. "Miller," Brody said, turning to his deputy, "get everyone back further. Another 100 yards at least. This whole area could be unstable." Miller nodded mutely, relieved to have a concrete task, and began ushering the small knot of onlookers away from the tape. Brody turned his attention back to the pit. He felt a primal urge to step away, to put distance between himself and this, wound in the world. But it was his job to face it, to understand it, or at least to manage the fallout. He squinted, trying to penetrate the darkness. Was that movement down there? A flicker of shadow against shadow? He shook his head. Tricks of the light, or lack thereof. Stress. But the feeling persisted. A sense of vast, unseen presence emanating from the depths. "Heard anything?" Brody asked Henderson, keeping his voice low. "Any noises coming from it?" Henderson finally tore his gaze away, his eyes hollow. "Just quiet, Sheriff. Too quiet. Like it swallowed all the sound. But sometimes I think I hear something. Like wind blowing through a cave, way down deep. or breathing. He shivered despite the warming day. Maybe I'm just going crazy. Brody didn't think he was. He felt it too, a subtle vibration through the soles of his boots, a low thrumming that was almost below the range of hearing. It resonated in his chest, a deeply unsettling hum that seemed to sync with his own pulse, tightening the band of anxiety around his ribs. He saw another vehicle approaching slowly along the track. Martha Gable's ancient Buick, navigating the ruts with ponderous dignity. She parked some distance away and got out, leaning heavily on her oak cane. Martha was in her late 70s, sharp as a tack, and possessed a memory for local history and folklore that put the county records to shame. She moved with a deliberate slowness, her eyes, bright and bird-like, already fixed on the sinkhole. Brody watched her approach, a knot of unease tightening in his gut. If anyone in Blackwater Flats might have an inkling of what this truly was, beyond the geological explanations he knew were already being formulated back in Lincoln, it would be Martha. She stopped near Brody, her gaze sweeping over the devastation, lingering on the unnatural darkness within the pit. She didn't seem surprised, not exactly. More resigned, as if she'd been expecting something like this, perhaps not in specifics, but in essence. "The earth bleeds sometimes, Sheriff," she said, her voice thin but steady, carrying easily in the strange silence, especially where old wounds run deep. Brody frowned. "It's a sinkhole, Martha." Even as he said it, the words felt inadequate, dismissive of the palpable wrongness hanging in the air. Martha tapped her cane lightly on the dusty ground. "Geology explains how, Brody. It rarely explains why." She looked directly at the pit again, her expression grim. "This ground, it remembers things best left buried." Henderson's farm sits near the old Blackwater Creek trace, the original one, before they diverted it back in the 30s. They said the natives wouldn't camp near the old creek bed. Called it thin ground, place where the whispers were louder. Brody felt a chill despite the sun. Whispers. Henderson thought he heard breathing. He pushed the thought away. Superstition, grief, shock, rational explanations. "We've got geologists coming out from the university," he said, trying to inject a note of official reassurance into his voice. "They'll figure out what caused it." Martha merely looked at him, her eyes holding a deep, unsettling knowledge. "They'll measure the depth, Sheriff. They'll analyze the soil. They'll write their reports." She gestured vaguely towards the chasm with her cane. "But will they listen to what the pit is telling them?" Before Brody could reply, his radio crackled to life, shattering the oppressive quiet. Miller's voice, tight with something Brody couldn't immediately identify, excitement or fear. "Sheriff? You might want to see this. Over here, near the north edge." Brody exchanged a look with Martha, whose expression remained unchanged, as if she already knew. He turned and walked quickly towards where Miller stood, pointing down at something near the fractured rim of the sinkhole, something half hidden by a newly tilted slab of earth. As he got closer, the metallic tang in the air intensified, mingling sickeningly with that faint, organic scent of decay. It wasn't dust or disturbed soil. It was the smell of blood, and beneath it, something else, oily and reptilian. Miller backed away as Brody approached, his face pale. Brody peered down. Lying partially crushed beneath the slab of earth, amidst the raw dirt and shattered roots, was the mangled carcass of a coyote. Its body was twisted at an impossible angle, fur-matted with dark fluid and gray dust. But that wasn't what made Brody's blood run cold. Its jaws were locked open in a silent rictus, and protruding from its throat, pushing outwards as if trying to escape, was something smooth, dark, and segmented like a chitinous, obsidian limb ending in needle-sharp claws. It pulsed faintly, slick with gore. It was undeniably, horrifyingly, not part of the coyote. Brody stared, his mind struggling to reconcile the image with any known reality. The limb, or whatever it was, pulsed with a faint, sickening rhythm, like some obscene black heart suddenly transplanted into the dead animal's throat. It was segmented, obsidian smooth in places, ridged in others. tapering to claws that looked like shards of volcanic glass. A thick, viscous fluid, darker than blood and shimmering with an oily rainbow sheen, oozed from where it ruptured the coyote's flesh. The metallic smell was overpowering now, acrid and coppery, burning the inside of Brody's nostrils. He felt a wave of nausea, while rising hot and bitter in his throat. He swallowed hard, forcing it down. Miller made a choke sound behind him and took another step back, his hand hovering near the butt of his service weapon, a useless gesture against whatever this was. Brody didn't blame him. The sight was fundamentally wrong, a violation of natural order so profound it felt like a physical blow. He'd seen gruesome things in his career, accidents, suicides, the aftermath of violence, but this was different. This felt invasive, alien. He forced himself to look away from the pulsating limb, scanning the immediate area. The ground near the carcass was disturbed, scuffed, suggesting a struggle. But there were no tracks leading away, none that he could readily identify anyway. Just the chaotic mess left by the sinkhole's formation and the gray, unsettling dust that coated everything. Whatever had done this to the coyote, whatever that thing inside it was, seemed to have originated from or retreated back into the pit itself. He took out his phone, his hands surprisingly steady despite the tremor running through him. He snapped several pictures, the flash momentarily illuminating the grotesque scene in stark, unwelcome detail. The images on the small screen looked no less real, no less horrifying. "Miller," Brody said, his voice tight. "Extend the tape. Nobody comes within 50 feet of this spot. Nobody." He looked back towards Henderson and the others, now further away but still watching intently. "Keep everyone back, understand? I don't want panic." Miller nodded, his face still pale, but regaining a semblance of professional composure. "Yes, sir." What is that thing, Sheriff?" "I don't know," Brody answered honestly, holstering his phone. "And right now, I don't want anyone else knowing either. Just secure the area." He glanced back at the pit, then at Martha Gable, who had slowly made her way closer. Her eyes missing nothing. Her expression wasn't shocked. It was one of grim confirmation, as if the dead coyote was merely exhibit A in a case she'd been arguing silently for years. "The ground gives back what it takes, sometimes," Martha murmured, her gaze fixed on the pulsing horror within the coyote's throat. "Or pieces, anyway. Appetizers." Brody ignored the comment, though the word appetizers sent a fresh wave of cold dread through him. He heard the sound of another engine, heavier this time, grinding its way up the track. A white pickup truck with the university logo on the door pulled up behind his cruiser. A man climbed out, tall and lean, probably in his late 30s, wearing practical hiking boots, cargo pants, and a university-branded windbreaker despite the still air. He had sharp features, intense blue eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, and an air of brisk, academic confidence. He carried a sturdy-looking case in one hand and had a device strapped to his wrist that looked like an oversized watch. This had to be the geologist. The man strode towards them, his eyes immediately drawn to the scale of the sinkhole, a flicker of professional fascination crossing his face before settling into a more serious, analytical expression. "Sheriff McLean?" he asked, extending a hand. "Dr. Ayres Thorne, Department of Earth and Atmospheric Sciences. Quite the feature you have here." His gaze swept over the devastation, clinical and appraising. Brody shook his hand. Thorne's grip was firm, dry. "Doctor, appreciate you coming out on such short notice." Brody gestured vaguely towards the pit. "As you can see, it's significant." Thorne nodded, already pulling a pair of high-powered binoculars from his jacket. He walked carefully towards the caution tape Brody had initially set up, well clear of the area around the coyote, and began scanning the edges of the chasm. "Significant is an understatement, Sheriff. The scale is remarkable. Initial reports mentioned possible karst activity, but this morphology, the sheer violence of the collapse, the lack of visible water action at the rim, it's atypical for this region." He lowered the binoculars, frowning slightly. "Any seismic activity reported locally? Tremors?" Anything leading up to it? Nothing official, Brody said. Folks felt something, maybe. Hard to say if it was before or after. Happened sometime overnight. Thor made a non-committal sound, pulling out a handheld device that looked like a sophisticated scanner. He pointed it towards the pit. Let's get some preliminary atmospheric readings, TDR measurements, see if we can get a sense of the depth and stability. He seemed entirely focused on the geological puzzle, oblivious to the thicker tension hanging in the air, the palpable sense of wrongness. Martha Gable cleared her throat softly. The depth isn't measured in feet, Doctor, she said. Thorne glanced at her, a brief, slightly dismissive smile touching his lips. Mom, I assure you, my equipment is quite accurate. Eris Thorne, this is Martha Gable, Brody interjected quickly, hoping to head off a clash between science and folklore before it began. Martha's family has lived here for generations. She knows this land. Thorne gave Martha a polite nod, his attention already returning to his scanner. A pleasure, Ms. Gable. Local knowledge can be invaluable. Soil composition, historical water levels. He trailed off, squinting at the reading on his device. That's odd. What is it? Brody asked, stepping closer. Atmosphere particulate count is extremely high, Thorne muttered, tapping the screen. And the composition, unusual trace elements. High concentration of sulfur compounds, methane, almost volcanic, but there's no volcanic activity anywhere near here. And this EM field, he adjusted something on the device, fluctuating wildly. Interference? He shook his head. Shouldn't be anything out here causing this kind of interference. Martha watched him, her expression unchanging. The air is wrong. The ground is wrong. Thorne looked up, clearly beginning to feel the dissonance between his scientific expectations and the data his instruments were feeding him, not to mention the oppressive atmosphere. He glanced towards the cordoned-off area where Miller stood guard, noticing the deputy's rigid posture, the way he kept glancing nervously towards the ground. Something else going on, Sheriff? Brody hesitated. He didn't want to spook the scientist, didn't want to sound like a crazy backwoods sheriff reporting monsters. But the evidence was lying right there, pulsing obscenely under a slab of earth. We found something, Brody said, keeping his voice low. Something I think you need to see. Maybe your unusual readings relate to it. He led Thorne towards the spot, signaling Miller to stay put but remain vigilant. As they approached, the metallic, bloody scent hit Thorne. He stopped, his nose wrinkling. What in God's name is that smell? Brody didn't answer, just pointed towards the mangled coyote and the impossible limb protruding from it. Thorne followed his gaze, his confident stride faltering. He stopped dead, his eyes widening behind his glasses. The academic detachment vanished, replaced by sheer, unadulterated disbelief, quickly followed by revulsion. My God, what is that? He took an involuntary step back, his gaze fixed on the pulsing, chitinous thing. Is that coming out of the animal? Looks that way, Brody said grimly. Found it like this just now. Thorne stared, his scientific mind clearly struggling to categorize the horror. He fumbled for the scanner again, aiming it towards the carcass, then quickly pulled it back. The EM readings spike erratically near it, he whispered, more to himself than to Brody. In the air, higher concentrations of those same sulfurous compounds, methane, ammonia. He shook his head, looking from the carcass to the pit and back again. This isn't geological decay. This is biological, but like nothing I've ever encountered. That appendage, the structure, it defies terrestrial biology as I understand it. Thin ground, Martha Gable said softly, having followed them at a distance. Sometimes things push through. Things that don't belong on this side. Thorne shot her an irritated look, unnerved but still clinging to rationality. Sheriff, with all due respect to MS. Gable's local color, there has to be a scientific explanation. A mutated organism, perhaps exposed to unknown subterranean chemicals? A deformed parasite, even as he offered the possibilities? They sounded weak, inadequate in the face of the pulsing reality before them. Brody looked towards the vast, dark opening of the sinkhole. The sun was climbing higher, but no light seemed to penetrate its depths. The silence had returned, thick and watchful. The coyote, the strange limb, the anomalous readings, the unsettling atmosphere. It all pointed towards the pit. Whatever was happening in Blackwater Flats, its source lay down there, in that unnatural darkness. "Whatever it is, Dr. Brody said." His voice heavy, "It came from that hole. Or something like it did. And that dead coyote, I don't think it's going to be the last." He felt a cold certainty settle in his gut. This wasn't just a geological event they had to manage. It was the beginning of something else, something terrifyingly unknown. The scar on the plains wasn't just a scar anymore. It was an open door. He looked at Thorne, whose face was pale, his scientific certainty visibly shaken. He looked at Martha, whose ancient eyes seemed to hold the grim weight of foreknowledge. He looked back at the pit, feeling the almost imperceptible thrumming through the ground again. Night was still hours away, but Brody felt a premature darkness gathering, not just in the depths of the sinkhole, but in the hearts of everyone standing at its precipice. He needed more men. He needed answers. And he needed them before whatever else was lurking in that abyss decided to crawl out into the Nebraska sunlight. His gaze drifted towards the farmhouse, where Jed Henderson still stood like a man turned to stone, staring at the ruin of his land, the ruin of their world. Chapter 2. Echoes from the Pit. 3 days. 3 days since the earth had opened and swallowed Jed Henderson's West 80. 3 days since Sheriff Brody McLean had stared down at the grotesque, pulsing thing emerging from a dead coyote. A sight burned onto the inside of his eyelids. In those 3 days, Blackwater Flats had transformed. The initial shockwave of the event had subsided, replaced by a low, simmering anxiety that coated the town like the ubiquitous gray dust still settling from the sinkhole's birth. Officially, the narrative being cautiously fed to the sparse regional news outlets that bothered to cover it was one of an unprecedented geological event. State geologists had arrived alongside Dr. Eris Thorne, set up more sophisticated monitoring equipment around the ever-widening perimeter of the exclusion zone, and issued vaguely reassuring statements about soil stability assessments and ongoing investigations. The mangled coyote and the impossible limb within it had been quietly bagged, tagged as biohazard evidence of an unknown animal interaction, and transported back to a state lab in Lincoln, disappearing into the bureaucratic maw with disconcerting speed. Brody had a feeling he'd never see a conclusive report on that. But the official story wasn't holding water in Blackwater Flats. People talked. They whispered in the aisles of the feed and seed, huddled in booths at Millie's Diner, nursing lukewarm coffee, their voices low, eyes darting towards the western horizon even though the pit itself was miles out of sight. They talked about the smell, that faint metallic, swampy odor that sometimes drifted into town on the otherwise still air. They talked about the silence, the unnerving lack of birdsong near the Henderson place, the way their own dogs whined and paced restlessly at night. They talked about the dreams, vivid, disturbing nightmares shared with unsettling similarity, featuring immense, crushing darkness, impossible geometries, and the feeling of something vast and ancient stirring beneath their feet. Fear, thick and cloying, was beginning to weave itself into the fabric of the town. Brody felt it constantly now, a knot tightening in his stomach every time the radio crackled, every time he drove past the turnoff to the Henderson farm. He'd double patrols around the exclusion zone, not just Miller, but calling in favors from neighboring counties for extra manpower, stretching his already thin resources. Keeping people out was proving almost as difficult as figuring out what was in. Curiosity, morbid and irresistible, drew people like moths to a flame. He'd caught teenagers trying to sneak past the barriers for a closer look, and even a couple of older folks who should have known better, armed with cameras and a misplaced sense of adventure. The official explanation wasn't enough. They needed to see the impossible truth for themselves, even if they couldn't comprehend it. Dr. Eris Thorne was perhaps the most visibly affected. though he tried desperately to mask it behind a facade of scientific rigor. Brody found him near the sinkhole's edge late one afternoon, standing beside a tripod-mounted device, humming softly. Thorne hadn't left Blackwater Flats since arriving. He'd taken a room at the town's only motel, a slightly dusty establishment near the highway, and seemed to spend nearly 18 hours a day out here, collecting data that only seemed to deepen the frown lines etched around his eyes. He looked tired, his usual academic energy replaced by a wired, obsessive tension. "Anything new, Doc?" Brody asked, stepping carefully over a network of cables snaking across the ground. Thorne jumped slightly, startled out of his concentration. He pushed his glasses up his nose. "Sheriff, just running some ground-penetrating radar sweeps, trying to map the subterranean structure, determine the extent of the cavity." He gestured vaguely at a tablet displaying a complex, shifting pattern of lines and colors. "The results are perplexing." "Perplexing how?" Thorne hesitated, chewing on his lower lip. "The cavity is deep, Sheriff. Impossibly deep. Far deeper than any known geological formation in this area should allow. My equipment, it's struggling to get a clear reading beyond a certain depth. Almost like something is actively interfering with the signal. Dense, maybe? Or—" He trailed off, shaking his head. "And the shape. It's not a typical void structure, like a cavern or eroded limestone chamber. It's structured, almost geometric in places, but defying Euclidean principles. Angles that shouldn't exist, dimensions that seem to fluctuate." Brody frowned. "Fluctuate? The readings aren't consistent," Thorne explained, frustration coloring his voice. "Run the same sweep 10 minutes apart, get subtly different results. The dimensions seem to shift. Breathe, almost. And the EM field is still highly erratic, spiking unpredictably. Plus, the low-frequency acoustic monitoring is picking up sounds." "Sounds?" Brody thought of Henderson's description: wind in a cave, breathing. "What kind of sounds?" "Low-frequency pulses. Rhythmic but not mechanical. Not geological either. Not like any seismic activity I've ever recorded. And other noises." Thorne looked genuinely unnerved now. "Scraping sounds, wet, tearing sounds, and sometimes something that sounds disturbingly like chattering, but deep, very deep." He ran a hand through his already messy hair. "None of this makes geological sense, Sheriff. It's like the laws of physics are getting fuzzy around this damned hole." Brody looked towards the pit. The sun was beginning its slow descent, casting long, distorted shadows across the landscape. The unnatural stillness seemed even more profound now, the air colder. He could almost imagine those sounds echoing up from the abyss, scraping, tearing, chattering. Appetizers. Martha had called a coyote. What was the main course? "Martha Gable," Brody said, thinking aloud. "She mentioned the natives called this area thin ground. Said they avoided it." Thorne scoffed, though the sound lacked conviction. "Sheriff, with all due respect, indigenous folklore, while culturally interesting, isn't likely to provide answers here. We're dealing with complex geological and potentially biochemical phenomena." "Are we?" Brody interrupted, his patience wearing thin. He gestured towards the pit. "Does any of that explain that?" He was pointing towards the edge, where something had caught his eye. A dark shape, lying partially obscured by a clump of disturbed earth, not far from where they'd found the coyote. Thorne followed his gaze, his expression tightening. They walked over cautiously. It was a bird, a large hawk, judging by its size and plumage, though it was hard to be certain. It lay on its back, wings spread awkwardly, neck bent at an unnatural angle. Its eyes were wide, glassy, reflecting the darkening sky. But like the coyote, the horror wasn't just its death. Its beak was forced open, unnaturally wide and crammed inside. Choking it was a writhing mass of pale, grub-like things, segmented and glistening wetly, pulsing with slow, deliberate movement. They spilled out slightly onto the dusty ground, leaving trails of slime. The same faint, metallic, decaying odor rose from the carcass. Thorne stared, his face pale green in the fading light. "No," he breathed. "Not again." "How?" Brody didn't answer. He felt a cold dread seep into his bones. First a coyote, now a hawk. Ground and air, whatever was down there. It wasn't staying down there. It was reaching out, its influence spreading, corrupting, killing. These weren't random acts of nature. This felt targeted, probing, testing the boundaries. Suddenly, one of the low-frequency acoustic monitors Thorne had placed near the rim emitted a sharp, piercing screech of static, followed by a deep, guttural thump that resonated through the ground. Felt more than heard. Both men flinched, spinning towards the pit. The humming sensation Brody sometimes felt intensified dramatically for a moment, a physical pressure in his chest. Then silence. Deeper, more absolute than before. The humming faded. The monitors went quiet. Thorne scrambled back to his equipment, checking readings frantically. "Massive energy spike," he exclaimed. "Off the charts." Then nothing. "Systems are going offline near the edge. Power fluctuations. Signal loss." Brody gripped the handle of his holstered weapon, his knuckles white. He stared into the impenetrable darkness of the sinkhole, every instinct screaming danger. That thump, it hadn't sounded geological. It had sounded like something immense shifting its weight in the depths. Like something heavy landing, or something large taking a step. The echoes from the pit were getting louder. And they were no longer just sounds. They were taking physical form. The dead hawk, choked with its writhing payload of pale abominations, seemed to mark a turning point. The incident, combined with the inexplicable energy spike and equipment malfunction, pushed Dr. Eris Thorne further away from comfortable scientific certainty and deeper into a state of unnerved fascination. He stopped talking dismissively about folklore and started listening, albeit reluctantly, when Martha Gable spoke. He still clung to the language of science. EM fluctuations, anomalous biological samples, acoustic disturbances, but the rigid confidence was gone, replaced by a kind of haunted curiosity. He began cross-referencing his sensor data with Martha's cryptic references to ley lines, thin places, and cycles of dormant monstrosity tied to celestial alignments she claimed her ancestors had tracked. He called it correlating historical anecdotal data with geophysical anomalies. But Brody knew Thorne was grasping at straws, trying to fit the impossible into a framework he could somehow, however tenuously, understand. Martha, for her part, seemed unsurprised by the escalating weirdness. She'd shown up at Brody's office the morning after the hawk incident, carrying a heavy, leather-bound book filled with brittle, yellowed pages of handwritten notes and strange, spidery diagrams. It wasn't scripture, nor local history as commonly understood. It was a family grimoire of sorts, passed down through the Gable line, detailing generations of observations, warnings, and half-understood rituals related to the weak spots in the land around Blackwater Flats. "The cycle turns, Sheriff," she'd said, her bony finger tracing a complex, multi-limbed sigil that made Brody's skin crawl. "The sleepers stir when the stars are right, or when the earth is wounded deeply enough. This hole, it's more than a wound. It's an invitation." She pointed to a passage written in faded ink, the script archaic but legible. "From a tear in the soil shall the old ones seep, their hunger roused from an age of sleep. They shall wear the skins of the beasts of the field, and twist the thoughts of men, their doom sealed." Brody, a man grounded in warrants and witness statements, found himself listening intently. Martha's ancient book, filled with what should have been dismissed as superstitious ramblings, seemed to resonate more accurately with the growing horror than Thorne's scientific reports. "The old ones?" he asked, the term sending an involuntary shiver down his spine. "Different names through different ages," Martha replied, her eyes distant. "Things from before. Things that burrowed deep when the world was young and cold. They don't think like we do, Sheriff. They don't feel like we do. They only consume, absorb, make things part of themselves." She looked directly at him. "That's what happened to the coyote, the hawk. They weren't just killed. They were incorporated. The idea was profoundly disturbing. Not just death, but a horrifying assimilation. Brody thought of the pulsing limb, the writhing grubs, parts of something larger, testing the surface world, or worse, converting terrestrial life into extensions of itself. The unease in town deepened, moving beyond whispers and nightmares into tangible events. Livestock began acting stranger than ever. Cattle would stampede without apparent cause, sometimes injuring themselves against fences. Chickens were found dead in their coops, not killed by predators, but seemingly having died of sheer fright, their eyes wide, feathers ruffled. More disturbingly, pets started disappearing. Cats vanished overnight. Dogs, usually reliable and loyal, would suddenly turn skittish or aggressive, barking frantically at empty shadows or growling at their owners before bolting into the night, never to be seen again. The disappearances were subtle at first, easily dismissed, but the pattern became undeniable. Something was quietly, methodically thinning the herd. Then came the disappearances of people. Not overt abductions, nothing so crude, just absences. Old Mr. Abernathy, who lived alone out on County Road 9 and rarely missed his Tuesday morning coffee at Millie's, simply wasn't there one week. His truck was in the drive, the door to his house unlocked, a half-eaten meal on the table. No sign of struggle. He was just gone. Deputy Miller found his prize-winning beagle cowering under the porch, trembling uncontrollably, refusing to come out even for food. A week later, Sarah Jenkins, a young woman who worked the late shift at the gas station, didn't return home after closing up. Her car was found parked behind the station, keys in the ignition, purse on the seat. Again, no struggle, no obvious clues, just an empty space where a person should be. Brody felt the investigation slipping through his fingers like dry sand. There are no bodies, no ransom notes, no witnesses, just evaporation. He filed missing persons reports, interviewed neighbors who hadn't seen anything unusual, drove endless miles down dusty roads searching for clues that didn't exist. The official explanation leaned towards people simply leaving town. Maybe Abernathy had family trouble. Maybe Sarah had run off with a boyfriend. But Brody knew better. The disappearances felt connected, linked by the same invisible thread of dread that emanated from the sinkhole. He remembered Martha's words, "Twist the thoughts of men." Was it possible? Could the influence from the pit affect people's minds, lure them away, make them compliant? Dr. Thorne, meanwhile, was becoming increasingly agitated by his own findings. His instruments near the pit continued to register bizarre energy fluctuations and deeply unsettling subterranean sounds. He'd started wearing noise-canceling headphones while working near the edge, claiming the low-frequency pulses were giving him migraines and auditory hallucinations. He showed Brody printouts of the acoustic data. Complex waveforms spiked with jarring bursts of static and periods of rhythmic, almost biological pulsing. And then there were the chattering sounds, now recorded with greater clarity. They weren't animalistic. They sounded almost linguistic, but in a language so alien, so filled with clicks, guttural stops, and sibilant whispers, that listening to the recordings made Brody's teeth ache. "I ran spectral analysis," Thorne said, his voice strained. "Compared it against every known language database, animal vocalizations, geological noise patterns. Nothing matches. Nothing even comes close. The complexity suggests intelligence, sheriff, but the structure, it's fundamentally non-human. Non terrestrial." He lowered his voice. Sometimes I think I can almost make out patterns. Repetitions. Like names." Brody felt a cold fist clench in his gut. Names. Names for the old ones. Names whispered up from the bowels of the earth. One evening, Thorne called Brody on the radio, his voice tight with urgency. "Sheriff, get out here. Now, bring backup. And tell them to be ready for anything." Brody arrived at the Henderson place within minutes, Miller close behind in his own cruiser. The scene was bathed in the harsh glare of portable floodlights Thorne had set up, powered by a portable generator humming loudly, fighting against the encroaching twilight. Thorne stood near the pit's edge, beside one of his more robust sensor arrays, a metal tripod topped with various cameras and detection equipment. He was pale, breathing heavily. "What is it, Eris?" Brody demanded, walking quickly towards him. Thorn pointed a trembling finger towards the sensor array. "Look, the thermal camera." Brody peered at the small monitor attached to the tripod. It displayed a heat signature view of the pit's edge and the darkness beyond. Most of the image was cool blues and greens, representing the evening air and the cold earth. But emerging slowly, cautiously, from the absolute blackness of the whole, were several indistinct shapes registering in warmer yellows and oranges. They were amorphous, shifting, difficult to resolve clearly, but undeniably present. They moved with a slow, tentative fluidity like amoebas testing the surface. There were maybe 3 or 4 distinct heat signatures, oozing over the fractured rim onto the dusty ground. "What are they?" Miller breathed, standing beside Brody, his hand instinctively going to his weapon. "I don't know," Thorn whispered, his eyes glued to the screen. "They don't register clearly on visual spectrum. Light seems to bend around them, refract oddly. But thermally, they're there. Biological heat signatures, but shifting, unstable." As they watched, mesmerized and horrified, one of the shapes elongated, stretching out a pseudopod-like appendage towards the sensor array. It moved with a disconcerting speed, flowing across the ground like thick, dark oil. It touched the base of the metal tripod. There was a sudden, sharp, sizzling sound like water hitting a hot skillet, accompanied by a plume of acrid smoke that stank of ozone and something else, something foully organic. The thermal signature on the screen flared brightly where the entity touched the metal, then vanished as the monitor abruptly went black. The floodlights flickered, and the generator coughed and died, plunging the scene into near darkness, lit only by the distant glow of farmhouse lights and the cold, indifferent stars. Silence rushed back in, absolute and terrifying. Brody automatically drew his service weapon, Miller doing the same beside him, their flashlights cutting sharp, nervous beams into the sudden gloom. Thorn let out a strangled cry, fumbling for a heavy-duty flashlight from his belt. They swept their beams across the ground where the thermal signatures had been. Nothing. The ground was empty, undisturbed except for the faint scorch mark at the base of the now-darkened sensor tripod. The shapes were gone, retreated back into the impenetrable darkness of the pit as quickly and silently as they had emerged. But they hadn't left entirely without trace. The air was thick with that ozone and rot stench, and the silence felt different now. It felt occupied, watched. The echoes from the pit were no longer echoes. They were here. They had crossed the threshold, the sudden plunge into darkness, broken only by the frantic beams of their flashlights, felt like a physical blow. The silence that followed the generator's death was absolute, pressing in on them from all sides, amplifying the frantic thumping of Brody's own heart. The ozone and rot stench hung heavy in the air, a tangible reminder of the entities that had momentarily surfaced. Miller was breathing raggedly beside him, his flashlight beam dancing nervously across the empty ground near the pit's edge. Thorn stood frozen for a moment, his face a mask of shock in the stark flashlight glare, before fumbling desperately with the dead generator, muttering curses under his breath. "Leave it, Doc," Brody ordered, his voice sharp, cutting through the tension. "It's dead. We're leaving. Now." He didn't need Thorn's instruments to tell him they were dangerously exposed. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming, a palpable pressure emanating from the abyss just yards away. The brief glimpse on the thermal camera hadn't been a glitch or a hallucination. It was real, amorphous, heat-radiating shapes that could disable technology with a touch and vanish without a trace. Things that defied physics and biology as they knew it. But the data... Thorn protested weakly, gesturing towards the inert sensor array. "The only visual confirmation is gone," Brody snapped, grabbing Thorn's arm, urging him back towards the vehicles. "And we're next if we stay here. Miller, cover our retreat. Keep your beam on the edge." Miller nodded wordlessly, backing away slowly, his service weapon held ready. His flashlight beam sweeping methodically across the fractured rim of the sinkhole. Brody practically dragged Thorne, who stumbled along, glancing back towards the pit with a horrified fascination. They reached the relative safety of the cruisers, the familiar metal and glass offering a thin psychological barrier against the encroaching dread. They touched it, Thorne stammered, sinking into the passenger seat of Brody's cruiser, running a shaking hand over his face. Just flowed right over the metal. The energy discharge wasn't electrical shorting, Sheriff. It was absorbed, drained, like the metal itself was consumed on a molecular level. He looked at Brody, his eyes wide with a terror that went beyond scientific anomaly. What are they? Brody didn't have an answer. He slammed the cruiser door shut, the sound echoing unnaturally loud in the stillness. Miller reached his own vehicle, his relief visible even in the dim light. Brody started the engine, the familiar rumble a small comfort. He reversed quickly, turning the cruiser around, bathing the area near the pit in the sweep of his headlights. Nothing, just the dead generator, the inert tripod, the jagged edge of the hole, and the immense, silent darkness. But the emptiness felt charged, expectant, waiting. The drive back toward town was conducted in near silence, punctuated only by Thorne's occasional shaky breaths and the crackle of the radio. As Brody informed dispatch, he was clearing the Henderson site for the night, advising no one approach until daylight, citing equipment malfunction and unstable ground. It felt woefully inadequate. Back in the relative sanity of his brightly lit office, the fluorescent bulbs humming overhead, Brody tried to process the night's events. Miller stood near the door, still looking pale. Thorne sat hunched in a chair, staring blankly at the wall, occasionally jotting frantic notes and calculations onto a pad, equations interspersed with crude sketches of the amorphous shapes he'd seen on the thermal display. "All right," Brody said, breaking the silence. "We need to reassess. Thorne, scientifically, what are we dealing with? Give me your best guess," Folklore sighed. Thorne looked up, his eyes haunted. "Scientifically?" He gave a short, harsh laugh devoid of humor. "Sheriff, science is starting to look like a very small flashlight in a very large, very dark room, filled with things we don't have names for. Based on the thermal signature, the energy absorption, the apparent lack of stable physical form visible to the naked eye, we could be talking about some kind of plasma-based life. Extra-dimensional entities momentarily intersecting our reality. Complex, self-organizing energy fields. None of those theories fit neatly. They move with intelligence, purpose. They interact physically, drain energy sources, possibly manipulate electromagnetic fields to achieve a form of localized invisibility or light distortion. The closest analogs are in theoretical physics and, frankly, science fiction." He shook his head. "And that doesn't even account for the biological horrors, the coyote, the hawk. How do they fit in? Are they related? Different manifestations? Weapons?" Brody rubbed his temples. "Plasma-based life. Extra-dimensional entities. This was beyond anything his police training had prepared him for. So, we don't know what they are. We don't know how many. We don't know their objective, other than maybe consuming energy and life. And maybe spreading," Thorne added grimly. "If those things in the animals were reproductive spores or some kind of vanguard." The implication hung heavy in the air. Panic was already simmering in Blackwater Flats. Confirmation of actual entities emerging from the pit would ignite it into a wildfire. The disappearances took on a far more sinister light. Were Abernathy and Sarah Jenkins simply lured away, or were they incorporated? The thought made Brody feel physically ill. He needed more help, but who could he call? The state police? The National Guard? What would he tell them? Report amorphous energy beings emerging from a giant hole, citing folklore and readings from a spook geologist? They'd think he'd lost his mind, relieve him of duty, and maybe send a psych team before they sent reinforcements. He was on his own, with a young deputy, a terrified scientist. and an old woman with a book full of terrifying prophecies. His thoughts turned, inevitably, to Martha. He picked up the phone and dialed her number. She answered on the second ring, her voice calm, as if she'd been expecting his call. "Sheriff," she said simply. "Martha," Brody began, then paused, unsure how to phrase the insanity. "We saw something tonight. At the pit. Things came out." There was a moment of silence on the line. Then Martha sighed, a dry, papery sound. "They test the air," she said. "They taste the boundaries. It always begins this way. Small excursions. Testing our awareness, our defenses. Can they be stopped?" Brody asked bluntly. "Stopped," Martha echoed. "Perhaps contained. Driven back for a time. The old texts speak of rituals of bindings, of exploiting certain frequencies. Harmonics they cannot tolerate. Things tied to sunlight, to running water, to certain geometries. But these things are fragmented, Sheriff. Misunderstood even by those who wrote them down. And performing them requires belief. And sacrifice." Brody felt a chill. Sacrifice? What about weapons? Guns? Against mist and shadow? Martha scoffed gently. "You might as well try to shoot the wind. Their forms aren't always stable in our world. But they learn, they adapt, and they can influence the weak-minded. Turn neighbor against neighbor. The true danger isn't always the things themselves, but what they make us do." Her words resonated with the growing tension in town. Over the next couple of days, the atmosphere shifted from anxious whispers to outright fear. A rash of minor vandalism broke out. Tires slashed, windows broken. Crude symbols vaguely resembling the sigils in Martha's book spray-painted on the church door. Fights erupted at the local bar over perceived slights, fueled by alcohol and frayed nerves. People were jumpy, suspicious of shadows, suspicious of each other. The community cohesion that defined Blackwater Flats was starting to fray at the edges, just as Martha warned. Then, late one night, Brody's radio crackled with a call that made his blood run cold. It wasn't Miller this time. It was Millie, the owner of the diner, her voice choked with panic. Sheriff, you gotta come quick. It's Pete O'Connell. Oh God, Brody, he's locked himself in the hardware store. He's shouting nonsense, breaking things, and he's got a shotgun. He says they're inside the walls. He says they're whispering to him. Brody grabbed his keys, his heart pounding. Pete O'Connell, owner of the hardware store, deacon at the church, Little League coach, one of the most solid, dependable men in town. If the influence from the pit could reach him, twist his mind like this, then no one was safe. The echoes from the pit weren't just whispers anymore. They were shouting inside people's heads. The nightmare was no longer confined to the Henderson farm. It had come home to Main Street. Chapter 3, The Town That Bled. Main Street, Blackwater Flats, was rarely active after 10 p.m., usually surrendering to the quiet hum of the lone streetlight near Millie's and the vast, star-dusted silence of the surrounding plains. Tonight, it was a scene of jarring chaos. The flashing red and blue lights of Brody's cruiser and Miller's backup unit painted garish. Pulsing strokes across the familiar facades of the hardware store, the diner, and the shuttered post office. A small crowd of townsfolk, drawn from their beds by the commotion and Millie's panicked call, huddled together across the street, their faces pale and anxious in the emergency lighting, whispering amongst themselves. The focus of all the tension was O'Connell's hardware, its large front windows dark, the cheerful open sign ironically still hanging askew in the door. For within came the intermittent, terrifying sound of shattering glass, splintering wood, and Pete O'Connell's ragged, incoherent shouting. "Get back," Brody yelled, waving the onlookers further down the block. "Give us room." He exchanged a grim look with Miller. Pete O'Connell, solid as the Nebraska bedrock, everyone said. Coach kids baseball, served on the church council. Always ready with a helpful word or the right kind of screw for a fiddly job. Seeing him reduced to this, it felt like another foundational stone of their community crumbling away. "Pete," Brody called out, positioning himself near the front door but using the solid brick corner of the building for cover. His voice was loud, steady, trying to project calm he didn't feel. "Pete, it's Brody McLean. What's going on in there? Talk to me, buddy." A string of curses answered him, followed by a heavy thud, like something large being overturned. Then Pete's voice, strained and frantic, laced with a paranoia so thick it was almost tangible. "They're in here, Brody." In the walls, scratching, whispering things. "Told ya." Told everyone, but nobody listened. Another crash, followed by the unmistakable, deafening boom of a shotgun blast inside the confined space. Pellets ripped through a display of gardening tools near the front window, sending shards of plastic and terracotta flying. The crowd across the street gasped, shrinking back further. "Jesus Christ, bitch," Miller muttered, ducking instinctively. "Pete, listen to me," Brody shouted, heart pounding against his ribs. "There's no one in there but you. It's the stress, Pete. This whole town's stressed. That damn hole out of Henderson's, it's getting to all of us. Let me help you." "Help." Pete laughed, a wild, ragged sound that held no humor. "You can't help. They're everywhere." Came up from the pit. Crawling things, eyes, so many eyes, watching from the pipes, from the wiring. "Whisper my name." Sibilant hisses, you hear it. He sounded like he was weeping now, interspersed with furious shouts. Gotta make him stop. Gotta board up. Keep him out." Brody recognized the description the sibilant, whispering Thorne had mentioned from the acoustic recordings. The sense of being watched. The paranoia wasn't random. It was specific, echoing the phenomena associated with the pit. Martha's warning about twisted thoughts hammered in his mind. This wasn't just a mental breakdown. It was an infestation of the mind, seeded by the horror leaking from the sinkhole. "Pete, put the gun down," Brody pleaded, trying a different tack. "Think about Mary. Think about the kids. They need you. We can get you help. Real help. Mary," Pete sobbed. "They whisper about her too. Show me things, what they'll do. No, gotta protect them. Gotta kill the whispers." Another shotgun blast roared, this one blowing out the remaining glass in the front door, showering the sidewalk with glittering fragments. Brody flinched back as pellets whizzed past where he'd been standing moments before. This was escalating too fast. Pete was lost in his terror, a danger to himself and potentially anyone who tried to enter. Brody looked at Miller, saw the same grim, understanding mirrored in his deputy's eyes. They couldn't wait this out. They couldn't risk Pete hurting himself further or somehow getting out onto the street in this state. Protocol demanded containment, negotiation, but protocol hadn't accounted for cosmic horror's whispering madness into people's minds. "Tear gas," Miller suggested quietly, his hand hovering near the launcher in his trunk. Brody shook his head. "Too unpredictable. Could make him panic worse, start firing blind. We need to go in. Distraction, quick entry. Try non-lethal first, but be ready." His own service weapon felt heavy and cold in his hand. The thought of using it against Pete O'Connell made him sick. He formulated a quick plan. Miller would break the side window near the back, create a diversion. Brody would go through the shattered front door the second Miller made his move. He relayed the instructions, his voice low and urgent. Miller nodded, his face grim but determined. He circled around the side of the building, disappearing into the shadows. Brody took a deep breath, listening intently. Inside, Pete was still muttering, punctuated by frantic hammering sounds. "Boarding it up. Keep 'em out, nails. Need more nails." Then, the sharp shatter of the side window, followed immediately by Miller's shout, "Police! Drop the weapon, Pete." Brody moved instantly, kicking open the remains of the front door and lunging inside, weapon held ready. Flashlight beam cutting through the darkened, dust-filled interior. The store was chaos. Shelves were overturned, merchandise scattered everywhere, tools, paint cans, coils of rope. In the center of the aisle, illuminated by Brody's beam, stood Pete O'Connell. He looked like a cornered animal, wild-eyed, face streaked with sweat and tears, sawdust clinging to his clothes. He held the shotgun loosely, momentarily distracted by Miller's diversion. "Pete, drop it. Now," Brody commanded, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. Pete swung around, his eyes finding Brody. For a fleeting second, a glimmer of recognition of the old Pete flickered in his gaze. Then the paranoia slammed back down like a shutter. "You're with them," he shrieked, raising the shotgun. Not towards Brody, but towards a shadowy corner piled high with bags of fertilizer. "They're hiding, whispering, 'Gotta get him.'" He fired. The recoil slammed the shotgun back against his shoulder. In the same instant, before Brody could even react, Pete stumbled backwards over a fallen display rack. There was another deafening roar as the shotgun discharged again, this time aimed downwards. Towards himself, Pete collapsed in a heap amidst the scattered hardware, the shotgun clattering onto the concrete floor beside him. Silence. Absolute, ringing silence. Broken only by the frantic ticking of a display clock on a far wall and the horrified gasp from the crowd outside who had heard the final, fatal shot. Brody stood frozen for a heartbeat, the scene etching itself into his memory. Pete lying still, the spreading dark stain on his chest. The acrid smell of gunpowder mingling with the dust and the phantom scent of ozone that seemed to linger everywhere now. Miller rushed in from the side entrance, his face ashen. "Oh my God! Brody! Oh my God!" Brody forced himself to move, holstering his weapon, his legs feeling like lead. He knelt beside Pete, checking for a pulse, knowing already what he'd find. Nothing. Pete O'Connell, husband, father, deacon, friend, was gone, a victim not just of his own despair, but of the insidious tendrils of madness reaching out from the pit. He stood up slowly, looking around the wreck store. He half expected to see slime trails or pale grubs writhing in the shadows Pete had been shooting at. There was nothing but mundane wreckage. Yet the feeling was still there, the sense of a malevolent presence, amused, perhaps, by the chaos it had wrought. He walked numbly to the doorway, facing the silent, horrified crowd bathed in the flashing lights. He saw Martha Gable standing near the front, leaning heavily on her cane, her ancient eyes filled with a terrible sadness, but no surprise. He saw Dr. Thorne pushing his way through, drawn by the sirens, his scientific detachment completely shattered now, replaced by raw, unfiltered horror as he took in the scene. Brody didn't know what to say. How could he explain this? How could he reassure these people when their familiar world was actively turning against them, poisoning minds, driving good men to violence and death? He couldn't. All he could do was stand there, the sheriff of a town that was beginning to bleed from an invisible wound, a wound cut deep into the land and deeper still into the psyche of its people. The echoes from the pit had claimed their first casualty on Main Street. Brody had a sickening feeling they wouldn't be the last. The night was far from over, and the darkness spreading from the Hellgate of Nebraska felt deeper, colder, and infinitely more patient than he could have ever imagined. The aftermath of Pete O'Connell's violent end settled over Blackwater Flats like a shroud. Brody handled the grim practicalities with numb efficiency, directing Miller to secure the hardware store as a crime scene, though labeling it as such felt like a grotesque understatement, and coordinating with the county coroner, whose arrival from 60 miles away would take time. He addressed the horrified onlookers, his voice gravelly, offering thin platitudes about investigation and support that tasted like ash in his mouth. He saw the disbelief warring with terror in their eyes. Pete O'Connell wasn't some troubled outsider. He was one of them, solid and dependable, now gone, shattered by unseen forces whispering from the dark. If it could happen to Pete, it could happen to anyone. The unspoken question hung heavy in the humid night air. Who would be next? Dr. Thorne had retreated into himself, his face pale and slick with sweat despite the cooling night. The raw horror of Pete's death seemed to have finally breached the last walls of his scientific detachment. He kept muttering about auditory-driven psychosis, mass hysteria triggers, and environmental contaminants affecting neurochemistry. But the words sounded like desperate attempts to anchor himself to a reality that was rapidly dissolving around him. He clutched his notepad, his knuckles white, his eyes darting nervously towards the dark spaces between buildings, as if expecting amorphous shapes to ooze from the alleyways. Martha Gable simply watched the proceedings with an air of profound sorrow, her presence a silent, grim testament to the unfolding tragedy she seemed to have foreseen. She offered no, I told you SOS. Only a deep, weary understanding that was somehow more chilling than any overt condemnation. The following days saw the fragile tapestry of Blackwater Flats begin to unravel at an accelerating pace. Pete's funeral was a strained, somber affair, held under a sky the color of lead. Neighbors exchanged platitudes and condolences, but beneath the surface simmered a current of fear and suspicion. Glances lingered too long. Doors were locked earlier and more securely than usual. People started avoiding eye contact on the street. The easy familiarity that had once defined the town was curdling into wary distrust. Who was sleeping soundly? Who was hearing the whispers Pete had described? I might snap next. Several families quietly packed up and left, driving away without fanfare, their cars loaded down with belongings. Their departure wasn't announced, just noticed. Empty houses, drawn blinds for sale. Signs hammered hastily into front lawns, already showing signs of neglect. Their leaving created its own resentment among those who stayed, a bitter mix of envy and accusation. Were they cowards a band, wanting their community, or the only sane ones left? Brody couldn't blame them for running, but each departure felt like another stitch ripping loose, leaving the remaining fabric weaker, more vulnerable. The pit itself continued its malevolent brooding on the edge of town. Thorne, driven now by a desperate, almost frantic need to understand, if not control, the phenomenon, doubled down on his research. Often working alongside Martha, an unlikely alliance formed between the man of science and the woman of folklore, fueled by shared proximity to the impossible. Thorne would analyze soil samples show ING bizarre, non-terrestrial isotopic ratios, while Martha would consult her grimoire, finding correlating passages about the sour earth or star metal sickness. Thorne recorded infrasound pulses, emanating from the depths, complex and rhythmic. Martha found diagrams of binding frequencies and chants meant to soothe the troubled earth, though the specifics were frustratingly obscure or incomplete. They argued methodology, terminology, and the very nature of reality, yet a grudging respect grew between them, forged in the face of overwhelming shared horror. Physical anomalies, once confined to the immediate vicinity of the Sinkhole, began to manifest within the town limits with increasing frequency and strangeness. The faint metallic tang in the air became more persistent, sometimes strong enough to make eyes water. Tap water in some homes ran cloudy, leaving behind a fine, grayish residue that resisted cleaning. Strange fungal growths, unlike any low-cal species, erupted overnight on fence posts, tree trunks, even the damp brickwork of older buildings. They were often pallid, rubbery things, sometimes exhibiting a faint, sickly phosphorescence in the dark, pulsing with a slow, barely perceptible rhythm that mirrored the deep thrumming felt near the pit. Insects behaved erratically, swarms of flies gathering inexplicably indoors, spider spin. Vast, chaotic webs devoid of any discernible pattern, bees abandoning their hives en masse. Nature itself seemed to be falling sick, corrupted by the spreading influence. The town's infrastructure began to falter. Power outages became more frequent, localized brownouts, plunging neighborhoods into sudden darkness for hours at a time. The already spotty cell service grew. Worse, calls dropping constantly, data connections failing. The landline phones developed persistent static, strange clicks, and whispers sometimes audible beneath the dial tone, echoes of the pit bleed, eating into the copper wires. Then came the news that sealed their isolation. The bridge on Highway 6, the main artery connecting Blackwater Flats to the outside world to the east, was closed indefinite. Eli State inspectors cited rapidly developing structural weaknesses and unexplained geological subsidence in the bridge supports. To the west lay only miles of empty farmland and winding county roads that eventually petered out. They were effectively cut off, trapped in their dying town with a monstrous thing festering at its edge. The news sent a fresh wave of panic through the remaining residents. The feeling of being besieged, abandoned, intensified. Brody felt the pressure mounting daily, the weight of his badge heavier than ever. He was trying to maintain order in a town, succumbing to fear, investigating disappearances with no clues, dealing with escalating strange phenomena, and trying to prepare for what? An invasion? Total societal collapse? He found himself relying more on Martha's cryptic guidance and Thorne's increasingly bizarre scientific theories than on any police manual. He started carrying a heavy-gauge shotgun loaded with slugs in the cruiser's rack, alongside the standard-issue patrol rifle, though Martha's dismissal of conventional weapons echoed in his mind. Still, the solid weight of the steel was some small comfort. One sweltering afternoon, Miller radioed in, his voice uncharacteristically tight. "Sheriff, you need to see this." Down by the old creek bed, behind the Lutheran church. Brody arrived to find Miller standing near the sluggish, weed-choked creek, his flashlight aimed at the muddy bank. The air here was thick with the smell of decay and stagnant water, amplified by the omnipun metalitang. Miller pointed wordlessly. Half submerged in the mud and murky water, tangled in reeds and debris, was a woman's shoe. A sensible, low-heeled pump, the kind of person might ear to work. It was caked in mud, but Brody recognized it instantly. It belonged to Sarah Jenkins, the young woman who'd vanished from the gas station weeks ago. But it wasn't just the shoe. Clinging to it, partially obscuring the buckle, was a pulsing, grayish mass, roughly the size of a human fist. It looked sickeningly familiar, like a larger, more developed version of the pale grubs that had choked the hawk, or a detached piece of the amorphous entities Thorne had glimpsed on the thermal camera. It seemed anchored to the shoe leather, tendrils burrowing into the material, and it pulsed with that same slow, deliberate rhythm that seemed to echo the heartbeat of the pit itself. As Brody watched, a thin, filament-like pseudopod detached itself from He main mass and probed blindly at the surrounding mud, leaving a trail of iridescent slime. "Found it just like this," Miller whispered, his face grim. "No other sign of her. Just this." Brody felt a cold certainty wash over him. Sarah Jenkins hadn't just been lured away or run off. She'd been taken and incorporated, changed. This pulsating horror clinging to her shoe wasn't UST evidence. It felt like a message. A territorial marque. A remnant left behind, perhaps carelessly, perhaps deliberately, to taunt them. The pit wasn't just influencing their minds. It was physical. Harvesting them, turning them into something else, or perhaps using them as hosts. He looked up from the obscene thing in the mud towards the seemingly peaceful spire of a Lutheran church just beyond the trees. The whispers weren't just in Pete O'Connell's head anymore. The slime wasn't confined to the pit's edge. The bleeding had spread from the wounded earth into the very heart of Blackwater Flats, contaminating the water, the air, the ground, and now leaving obscene remnants of its victims in the shadow of the house of God. The fight wasn't about containment anymore. It was about survival, and Brody had the terrifying realization that they were losing. Brody stared at the obscene, pulsing gray mass clinging to Sarah Jenkins' muddy shoe, his stomach churning. This wasn't just evidence anymore. It was a violation, a grotesque trophy left behind by Tever had taken the young woman. The slow, rhythmic pulsing seemed to mock the quiet sanctity of the nearby churchyard, an alien heartbeat intruding upon consecrated ground. Miller looked ready to vom. His flashlight beam trembling slightly. "Bag it," Brody said, his voice raspy. "Evidence procedure. Use the heavy-duty hazmat kit from the trunk. Double bag it. And Miller, don't touch it directly. Use the grabbers. Miller nodded mutely, relieved to have a protocol to follow, however inadequate it felt. He retrieved the bulky orange kit from his cruiser, his movements stiff and deliberate. Brody kept his own flask. Flight trained on the pulsating node, watching its slow, deliberate probing of the mud. Did it sense them? Was it aware? The thought sent a fresh wave of revulsion through him. He half expected it to. Suddenly scuttle away or lash out. Carefully, using the extended tongs from the kit, Miller managed to lift the shoe and the attached mass from the sucking mud. The node seemed to cling tighter for a moment, emitting a faint, wet suck, ing sound as it came free. A few strands of iridescent slime stretched and snapped, falling back into the murky water. Miller deposited the grotesque object into a thick, transparent biohazard bag, and sealed it. He placed that bag inside another, sealing it just as carefully. He held the double bag package away from his body as if it might suddenly explode or melt through the plastic. "Where are we taking this?" Miller asked, his voice strained. Brody hesitated. The office felt too central, too exposed. Thorne had commandeered a small and used storage room at the back of the town hall, setting up a makeshift lab with his remaining functional equipment, powered by batteries and a small, sputtering backup generator he'd salvaged. It was marginally more secure. Town hall. Thorne needs to see this. And Martha. The drive back was tense. The bagged object sat on the floor of Miller's cruiser, an unwelcome passenger radiating a palpable sense of wrongness. Brody radioed Thorne and Martha, summoning them to the town hall, keeping his explanation brief and grim. "Found something related to Sarah Jenkins. Something you need to see." They gathered under the flickering fluorescent lights of the storage room, a cramped space smelling of dust, ozone from Thorne's equipment, and now, faintly, the metallic tang emanating from the bag. Ednode Miller placed carefully on a metal table. Thorne approached it with a mixture of clinical fascination and undisguised horror, his instruments already whirring and clicking as he took readings. Through the plastic bags, Martha stood back, leaning heavily on her cane, her face etched with profound weariness and sorrow. "Energy signature is consistent," Thorne muttered, peering at a handheld scanner. "Low-level EM field, fluctuating. Biological thermal output, but erratic. Higher concentration of those unknown sulf. UR and ammonia compounds. And it's emitting low-frequency pulses. Very faint, but rhythmic." He looked up, his eyes meeting Brody's. "It's like the things we saw on the thermal feed, Sheriff. But so, litified, stable, in this form." "It's a remnant," Martha said quietly, her gaze fixed on the pulsating mass. "A piece left behind, or planted, like a seed." "A seed for what?" Miller asked, blanching. Martha's eyes were grim. "For more." She tapped her ancient grimoire. The texts speak of the old ones spreading their essence, seeding the ground, the water, the living, preparing the way for their You'll emergence. These nodes, they anchor their influence. They corrupt. They might even communicate. As if on cue, the mass inside the bag gave a more pronounced pulse, a visible throb that made Thorne jump back. A faint, high-pitched whine, barely audible, emanated from it for a second before fading. "Did you hear that?" Thorne whispered, aiming a directional microphone towards the bag. Before anyone could answer, the lights in the room flickered violently, then died, plunging them into darkness save for the emergency exit sign's green glow and the beams of their flashlights. Thorne's battery-powered instruments continued to hum, their indicator lights casting eerie shadows. "Damn it, another power surge." Brody cursed, fumbling for his flashlight. "Not just a surge," Thorne said, his voice tight, pointing his scanner towards the bagged node. "Look." The EM field around the sample spiked dramatically just before the power failed. And the pulsing. "It's faster now." They trained their flashlights on the bag. The gray mass was indeed throbbing more rapidly, a sickly, urgent rhythm. The surface seemed to ripple, thin veins of darker color appearing just beneath a translucent skin. It reacted, Brody breathed, It reacted to the power grid failing. Or it caused it. Or it's calling, Martha whispered, her knuckles white on her cane. Calling to the others. Or to the source. The source. The pit. Even miles away, its influence felt immediate, palpable. Brody felt trapped, caught between the creeping, insidious infection spreading through the town and the monstrous heart of the problem festering out at the Henderson place. News of the discovery, or rather, distorted, terrified rumors of it, spread through the remaining townsfolk with predictable speed. Whispers turned into panicked accusations. People reported seeing strange lights near the creek bed, hearing scratching noises in their attics, finding more of the pale, phosphorescent fungi growing in their cellars. The fragile bonds of community snapped completely. Doors were barred not just against the night, but against neighbors. Hoarding became rampant. The shelves at the nearly depleted general store stripped bare in hours. An old feud between two farming families erupted into gunfire over property lines and imagined slights, leaving one man wounded and deepening the pall of fear and violence. Brody and Miller, already stretched thin, felt utterly overwhelmed, racing from one crisis to another, trying to hold together a town that was actively tearing itself apart under the invisible pressure. The psychological toll intensified. Brody found himself snapping at Miller, second-guessing his own decisions, plagued by nightmares filled with impossible angles and suffocating darkness. Miller grew, withdrawn, his face perpetually pale, jumping at shadows. Thorne became increasingly erratic, alternating between bursts of frantic scientific activity and periods of near-catatonic silence, staring at the pulsating node in its bag like a man hypnotized. Only Martha seemed to retain her grim composure, though the sadness in her eyes deepened with each new horror. One evening, Thorne, looking more haggard than ever, approached Brody with a new set of printouts. "Sheriff, the low-frequency pulses from the pit, they've changed." "Change how?" Brody asked wearily, looking up from a pile of useless incident reports. "They're more organized," Thorne said, spreading the papers on Brody's desk. They showed complex, repeating wave patterns. Less random noise, more structure, almost like signals, and the intensity is increasing steadily. Whatever is down there, it's becoming more active, more coordinated. He tapped a specific graph. "And look at this. There are faint, resonant pulses coming from within the two. WN now, matching the frequency from the pit. Faint, but measurable. Near the creek bed, yes, but also other locations. Randa houses, the church basement, even near this building." Brody felt ice slide down his spine. The seeds Martha spoke of. Anchors. The infection wasn't just spreading. It was creating a network, linking back to the source, turning Blackwater Flats into a GA-NT, receptive antenna dish for the horrors below. "Can we destroy that thing?" Brody asked abruptly, nodding towards the storage room where the node pulsed in its containment. "Burn it." Thorne looked horrified. "Destroy the only sample we have?" "Sheriff, we need to study it, understand its composition, its weaknesses." "Its weakness is fire, maybe." Brody shot back, his frustration boiling over. "While you're studying it, it's communicating, maybe helping whatever's down there coordinate God knows what. We're past studying Eris. We're running out of time." Before Thorne could reply, the police radio crackled, not with Miller's voice, but with a choked, terrified scream, followed by static. It was Deputy Riley from neighboring Dixon County, one of the men Brody had reluctantly called in for backup, assigned to patrol the perimeter near the secondary access roads. "Riley?" "Riley, report." Brody shouted into the mic silence, then another burst of static, a wet, tearing sound, and a final, gurgling gasp before the line went dead. Brody stared at the radio, his blood cold. Something had gotten Riley. Out there, on the edge of town, the bleeding edge where the influence of the pit was strongest. The probing was over. The coordination Thorne detected was beginning. The town wasn't just bleeding anymore. It was about to be overrun. Chapter 4, Containing the Nightmare. The dead silence on the radio, punctuated only by the lingering hiss of static where Deputy Riley's final, choked gasp had been moments before, was more terrifying than any scream. Brody felt the blue de-drain from his face. Riley wasn't just backup. He was a connection, however tenuous, to the outside world, to the sanity that seemed to be rapidly evaporating within Blackwater Flats, self-contained. Nightmare. That connection had just been brutally severed. Miller. Brody barked, already moving towards the door, grabbing the heavy shotgun from its rack. Let's go. Riley's last known location, County Road 12, near the old Peterson Farm turnoff. Miller needed no further urging, his face grim, already checking the load in his own shotgun. Thorns started to rise, a protest forming on his lips about safety protocols, but Brody cut him off. Stay. Here, Doc. You and Martha. Lock this place down. Bar the doors. Don't open for anyone unless you hear my voice, understand? Thorne nodded mutely, the gravity of the situation finally overriding his scientific impulses. Martha merely gripped her cane tighter, her eyes following Brody with a look of profound concern. The drive out of town was a blur of flashing lights cutting through the oppressive darkness. Brody pushed the cruiser hard, tires squealing on the turns, his mind racing. County Road 12 skirted the stern edge of the wider area affected by the pit, leading towards sparsely populated farmland. It was isolated, dark, the perfect place for an ambush for whatever horrors lurked in the shadows to STR. Ike. They found Riley's cruiser parked haphazardly on the shoulder of the gravel road, headlights still blazing, cutting a swath through an unusually thick patch of ground fog that clung unnaturally to the road and surrounding fields despite the lack of wind. The driver's side door was open, swinging gently. The interior dome light cast a weak glow, revealing the radio mic dangling, swinging like a pin. Dulham. No sign of Riley. Brody killed his own headlights, relying on the flashing emergency lights to illuminate the scene. He and Miller exited their vehicles cautiously, shotguns held ready, sweeping their flashlight beams through the swirling mist. The air here was colder, carrying that familiar stench of ozone and decay, stronger now, mixed with the coppery tang of fresh blood. Riley, Brody shouted, his voice muffled by the fog. No answer. They approached the empty cruiser. On the ground beside the open door, scuff marks in the gravel indicated a struggle. And blood. Not a lot, but enough, dark spatters glistening wetly in the flashlight. HT beams. Brody followed the sparse trail leading away from the road, towards the dense cornfield bordering the road, its dry stalks rustling faintly despite the still air. Miller covered him his gas. He's scanning the impenetrable rows of corn. The blood trail stopped abruptly about 10 feet into the field, near a section where the stalks were unnaturally bent and broken, not snapped cleanly, but twisted and shredded, as if something immense, Ly strong and clumsy, had thrashed through. And there, clinging to a broken stalk, was a scrap of fabric, blue, undeniably from Riley's uniform shirt. Beside it, half trampled into the earth, lay Ryle. Y's flashlight, its lens cracked but still emitting a faint, dying beam. But the most horrifying discovery was a single boot, Riley's standard-issue police boot, standing upright, as if still containing a foot, but gruesomely empty. And oozing slowly from the top of the boot, spilling onto the ground, was a thick, pulsating, grayish substance, identical to the node found on Sarah Jenkins' shoe on. Ly larger, pulsing with a more vigorous, sickening rhythm. God! Miller choked out, backing away. Brody felt bile rise in his throat again. Riley wasn't just killed. He was harvested, broken down, incorporated. This pulsating mass wasn't just a remnant. It felt like a conversion point, Riley's ES. Since being actively processed into something else, the sheer alien horror of it was paralyzing. Suddenly, a low, guttural, clicking sound emanated from deep within the cornfield, answered by a wet, tearing noise further down the road. Brody and Miller snapped their heads up, shotguns aimed toward. As the sounds, the fog swirled, shapes seeming to coalesce and dissolve within it. The feeling of being watched intensified, pressing in from all sides. They were exposed, vulnerable. "Back to the cars," Brody ordered, his voice low and urgent. Now, slowly, they retreated backwards, never taking their eyes off the cornfield and the surrounding fog, the silence amplifying every rustle, every click, every throb from the obscene thing in Riley's boot. Reach, the relative safety of the cruisers. They jumped in, locking the doors. Brody didn't hesitate, slamming the vehicle into reverse, gravel spitting from beneath the tires as he spun the car around Indy sped back towards town, Miller close behind. He didn't look back, but the image of the boot and its horrifying contents was seared into his mind. They burst back into the lockdown town hall, finding Thorne and Martha waiting anxiously. Brody quickly recounted what they'd found, the words tasting like poison. The confirmation that the entity, or entities, were actively hunting, physically dismantling victims, and leaving behind these grotesque nodes shattered any remaining illusions of containment or passive observation. "We can't wait," Brody declared, pacing the small room like a caged animal. "We can't wait for them to pick us off one by one, or drive us mad like Pete. We're cut off. Help isn't coming." "Thormart. Huh. Everything you know, everything you suspect, put on the table. Now, we need a weapon. We need a plan." The next hour was a frantic, desperate council of war. Thorne, energized by fear and adrenaline, laid out his theories. The entity seemed sensitive to specific EM frequencies, possibly disrupted by sonic resonance. The nodes acted as anchors or relays, potentially forming a network. Martha, consulting her grimoire under the harsh light, pointed to passages describing ancient wards, sigils meant to disrupt unclean spirits or earthbound abominations, and rituals involving harmonious vibrations and sunlight, or its symbolic representation. The book mentions frequencies, Martha said, tracing a spidery diagram. Certain tones, chants they scour the thin places, drive back the shadow. It says the vibrations must be pure, sustained. Thorne leaned closer, comparing the diagram to his own acoustic data printouts. Pure tones, sustained frequencies. "Sheriff, some of the equipment I salvaged might be able to generate specific sonic frequencies, broadcast them, if we knew the right frequency." "Martha, does your book specify?" Martha shook her head sadly. "The exact chants are lost or fragmented. But this symbol," she pointed to a complex, star-like sigil with intricate internal patterns. "This sigil of sundering. It's me. And to be inscribed where the influence is strongest, to break the connection, repel the entity. It supposedly resonates with the light of creation." A desperate, improbable plan began to form. They couldn't assault the pit itself, that felt like suicide, but they could target the known nodes within town, try to disrupt the network Thorne suspect. Weaken the entity's hold. Thorne believed he could modify one of his sonic emitters to broadcast a range of high-intensity, low-frequency pulses, a shot in the dark, hoping to hit a disruptive resonance. Simultaneously, they would attempt to physically destroy the nodes they could locate. The one from Sarah Jenkins still pulsing in its bag, the new one from Riley they'd had to leave behind. A chilling thought, and potentially others, guided by Thorne's sensor readings pinpointing anomalous energy signatures. Martha insisted the sigil of sundering needed to be inscribed at these locations. During the sonic assault, believing the combined effect was crucial, Brody added the grim necessity of conventional weapons, shotguns, perhaps fire, as a last resort if the sonic and symbolic ACH failed. It felt like a plan concocted from equal parts desperation, shaky science, and ancient superstition. A flimsy shield against an overwhelming, unknowable horror. They gathered their meager resources, Horn's remaining functional sonic emitter and battery packs, fuel for the generator to power it, Brody's and Miller's shotguns, extra ammunition, heavy-duty flashlights, Brody's dwindling supply of ode flares, and a can of white spray paint Martha deemed acceptable for inscribing the sigil. "We hit the one here first," Brody decided, nodding towards the bagged node on the table. Test the theory. If it works, or even if it just reacts, we know we're onto something. Then we figure out how to deal with the others. Thorn began modifying the sonic emitter, wires trailing, his face set in grim concentration. Martha meticulously practiced drawing the complex sigil of sundering on a spare piece of cardboard. Miller checked their weapons, his movements precise, his fear masked by drilled professionalism. Brody watched them, the sheriff of a dying town preparing to fight monsters with sound waves, spray paint. The shotgun. It was insane. It was probably hopeless. But it was better than waiting passively in the dark for the whispers to find them, or for something far worse to crawl out of the pit and claim Tish. Emal. The containment had failed. The nightmare was loose. Now, they had to try and fight it on its own corrupted ground. The small storage room felt like a pressure cooker, thick with tension, the smell of ozone, and the low hum of Thorn's jury-rigged sonic emitter warming up. Thorn made final adjustments, connecting the emitter to a heavy battery pack, his brow furrowed in concentration. Martha stood ready, the can of white spray paint clutched in her hand like a ritual object, her lips moving silently, perhaps exiting forgotten words from her grimoire. Miller stood near the door, shotgun held at a low ready, eyes scanning the corridor beyond. Brody hefted his own shotgun, the smooth wood of the stock strang, Eli comforting against his cheek. The target, the pulsating gray node in the double biohazard bag on the metal table. Sarah Jenkins's remnant. The potential seed. The anchor. All right, Thorn said, his voice strained. Emitter is charged. I'm starting with a low-frequency sweep. Ramping up through the spectrum Martha indicated might be disruptive based on those diagrams. It's going to be loud, and the infrasound might cause disorientation. Nausea. Be ready. Brody nodded grimly. Do it. Thorn threw a switch. The emitter sprang to life, emitting not a loud, audible noise, but a deep, resonant hum that vibrated through the concrete floor, felt more in the bones and teeth than heard wit. The ears. The air pressure in the small room seemed to increase, making Brody's ears pop. He instinctively braced himself. They all watched the bag node. For a few seconds, nothing happened. The gray mass continued its slow, rhythmic pulsing. Then, as Thorn slowly adjusted the frequency dial on the emitter, the pulsin G-hitched. It faltered, became erratic. The surface of the node seemed to writhe, darkening veins appearing and disappearing rapidly beneath its translucent skin. A faint, high-pitched keening sound, like stressed metal, began to emanate from it, audible even over the emitter's thrum. It's reacting, Thorn yelled, tweaking the frequency slightly. Higher intensity. The node pulsed violently now, slamming against the sides of the plastic bag. The keening intensified into a thin, piercing shriek that scraped along Brody's nerves. The smell of ozone and rot thickened, edged rapidly in the air. The sigil. Martha cried out, moving forward despite the waves of infrasound that made her stagger. Now, while it's agitated, Brody and Miller instinctively raised their shotguns, covering her. Martha, her face pale but resolute, aimed the spray can. With surprising steadiness, ignoring the shrieking from the bag and the disorienting thrum of the emitter, she began spraying the complex, star-like sigil of sundering directly onto the outer surface of the biohazard bag, her movements precise, following the pattern she had practiced. The white paint starkly contrasted against the clear plastic and the writhing gray horror within. The moment the sigil was complete, the reaction was immediate and violent. The node inside the bag seemed to convulse. The shrieking cut off abruptly, replaced by a wet, tearing sound. The gray massar rapidly darkened, turning almost black, and began to bubble and smoke, emitting thick, acrid fumes that stung Brody's eyes even from across the room. The bag containing it bulged outwards, straining AG. Ain't the plastic. It's destabilizing, Thorn shouted, shielding his eyes. Molecular breakdown? The combined frequencies, and whatever the sigil does, it's tearing it apart. With a final, sickening pop, The node seemed to liquefy, collapsing in on itself into a pool of foul-smelling, black sludge at the bottom of the bag. The fumes subsided slightly, leaving behind only tea. A stench of burnt chemicals and decay. The rhythmic pulsing had stopped. The node was inert, destroyed. A heavy silence fell, broken only by the fading hum of the emitter as Thorn shut it down and the ragged breathing of the 4 people in the room. They stared at the bag, at the harmless-looking black residue where the pulsating horror had been moments before. It worked, Miller breathed, lowering his shotgun slightly, disbelief warring with relief on his face. Holy hell, it actually worked. Brody felt a surge of fierce, desperate hope, the first he'd felt in days. It wasn't just superstition. The combination of Thorn's manipulated frequencies and Martha's ancient symbol had actually dawned. Something destroyed one of the enemy's anchors. It was a small victory, but in the face of such overwhelming dread, it felt monumental. One down, Brody said grimly, reloading his shotgun with methodical clicks that echoed in the sudden quiet. Now for the others. Their next target had to be the node near the cornfield, the one birthed from the remains of Deputy Riley. It felt like a necessary, albeit grim, act of vengeance and containment. Leaving out there, to pulse in the darkness, a beacon for whatever else lurked in the corn, was unthinkable. They loaded the emitter, batteries, and other supplies into Brody's cruiser. Martha, despite her age, insisted on coming. The sigil must be applied correctly, she stated firmly, leaving no room for argument. Thorn, emboldened by their success, seemed almost eager, already planning adjustments to the sonic frequencies. Miller, though still visibly shaken, projected a quiet determination. Driving back out towards County Road 12 felt different this time. The oppressive fear was still present, thick as the unnatural fog that continued to hug the ground, but now it was tempered by a slithe air of agency, a sense of purpose. They weren't just victims waiting for the slaughter. They were fighting back, armed with a bizarre but apparently effective combination of fringe science and ancient order. They found Riley's abandoned cruiser still sitting on the roadside, its headlights now dead, battery drained. The fog was thicker here, swirling in hypnotic patterns, muffling sound. They cautiously approached the edge of the cornfield where they'd found the boot. It was still there, standing upright in the dirt, the gray mass within it pulsing slowly, seemingly undisturbed. The air felt heavy, watchful. The clicks and rustles from within the corn seemed closer now, more numerous. Set up the emitter, Brody ordered quietly, scanning the dense rows of corn, his shotgun held ready. Miller, cover Thorn. Martha, stay close to me. Thorn quickly set up the sonic device, aiming it directly at the boot. As he powered it up, the familiar infrasound hum began, vibrating through the damp earth. Brody watched the node in the boot. It reacted almost instantly, the pulsing becoming rapid, erratic. A low, guttural moan seemed to issue from it, resonating disturbingly with the emitter's frequency. Martha now, Brody yelled over the thrum. Martha moved forward, spray can ready. But as she stepped towards the boot, a shape detached itself from the darkness within the cornfield. It moved with unnatural speed, low to the ground, a blur of segmented limbs and chitinous plating, vaguely insectoid, but far larger, maybe the size of a large dog. It scuttled directly towards Martha, multiple red eyes glowing dimly in the fog. Martha! Miller screamed, firing his shotgun without hesitation. The blast ripped through the fog, hitting the creature square in its midsection. It shrieked, a high-pitched, grating sound, and lead black ichor spraying from the wound, but it didn't stop. It lunged again. Brody fired simultaneously, his own shotgun blast catching the creature in its cluster of eyes. It staggered back, screeching, thrashing blindly, then collapsed, twitching, its limbs curling inwards. Before they could react, 2 more shapes emerged from the corn, flanking them, scuttling low and fast, their clicking mandibles echoing unervingly. Sigil. Finish the sigil, Brody roared, firing again at one of the new creatures, forcing it back momentarily. Miller engaged the other, the roar of their shotguns deafening in the confined space. Zol flashes momentarily illuminating the grotesque, multi-limbed horrors lunging from the mist. Martha, protected by their covering fire, reached the boot. Ignoring the chaos around her, she swiftly sprayed the sigil of sundering onto the pulsing gray mass. As the final line of the symbol was completed, the node reacted just as the first one had, convulsing, shrieking, then rapidly dissolving into black sludge with a final, wet pop. At the exact moment the node dissolved, the two remaining creatures attacking them recoiled as if struck, screeching in agony. They seemed disoriented, thrashing wildly for a moment before abruptly uttling back into the impenetrable depths of the cornfield, vanishing into the fog and darkness. Silence fell again, broken only by the crackling of damaged cornstalks and the ragged panting of the survivors. The emitter hummed steadily, Thorn having kept it running. The boot stood empty now, VE for the black residue. The creature Brody had shot lay still, already starting to dissolve into the same foul sludge. Miller quickly reloaded, his hands shaking. Martha leaned heavily on her cane, pale but unharmed. They retreated, Thorn stammered, staring into the cornfield. When a node was destroyed, it was like their connection was severed. They lost focus. Brody nodded, his mind racing. Martha had been right. Thorn had been right. The nodes were anchors. Destroying them weakened the entities, disrupted their link to this reality, or at least to this AR. They had found a weapon. A dangerous, terrifying weapon, but a weapon nonetheless. All right, Brody said, his voice grim but resolute. Let's go hunting. Thorn, check your sensors. Where's the next strongest signal? Thorn consulted his handheld device, his expression hardening. There are several faint readings scattered now, but the next most significant concentration, it's back in town. Strongest near the CH specifically, the church basement. The drive back to the heart of Blackwater Flats was grimly silent. The small victory out on County Road 12 felt fragile, overshadowed by the knowledge that they were heading towards consecrated ground that had seemingly become a focal point for the spreading infection. The Lutheran Church, with its slightly tilting steeple, had always been a symbol of endurance and quiet faith in the community, a comforting landmark against the vast prairie sky. Now, the thought of what might be festering in its basement filled Brody with a cold dread that went beyond the physical threat of the creatures. It felt like a desecration, a deliberate defilement aimed at the very soul of the town. As they rolled slowly down Main Street, the desolation was stark. More houses stood dark and empty. Debris, overturned trash cans, scattered papers, littered the sidewalks, signs of neglect and haste. A few remaining residents peered out from behind locked doors and curtained windows, their faces etched with fear and suspicion, watching the sheriff's cruiser pass like a hearse navigat. A plague-stricken city. The air felt heavy, stagnant, thick with the ever-present metallic tang and the low, almost subliminal thrumming that seemed to emanate from the earth itself now, a constant reminder of the pit's baleful influence. They parked near the church, the building looming silent and imposing in the darkness, its stained glass windows like vacant eyes reflecting the cold starlight. No lights burned within. The usual sense of peace and sanctuary surrounding it was gone, replaced by an unnerving stillness, a feeling of watchful malevolence. Thorn checked his scanner again, his expression tight. The readings are definitely centered here, he confirmed, his voice barely a whisper. Strong EM fluctuations, concentrated infrasound pulses originating from below ground level. Stronger than the individual nodes we encountered before. It might be a nexus point, or something larger. Let's get this done, Brody said, his voice low. He didn't like this. Every instinct screamed trap. Thorn, set up the emitter near the basement access. Miller, cover the main entrance. Martha, stay with Thorn. I'll check the basement door. The main basement access was a heavy wooden door set at an angle against the church's foundation at the rear, leading down a short flight of concrete steps. It was unlocked. Brody pushed it open slow. Why? The hinges groaning in protest, revealing a yawning blackness that smelled powerfully of damp earth, mildew, and something else, that same sickly sweet, rotten odor they'd encountered near the pit. And the nodes. He shone his flashlight down the steps. They disappeared into pitch darkness. No sound came from within, just an oppressive, waiting silence. Thorne quickly set up the sonic emitter near the top of the steps, aiming it downwards into the black maw of the basement. Martha stood beside him, spray can ready, her face grim. Miller took up posit, eye on near the church's main doors, shotgun scanning the shadowed street. "Ready when you are, Sheriff," Thorne said, his hand hovering over the power switch. Brody took a deep breath, chambered a round in his shotgun, and started down the steps, his flashlight beam cutting a nervous path through the absolute darkness. The air grew colder, damper the rot, and smed intensifying. He reached the bottom, finding himself in a large, low-ceilinged basement space. Old wooden shelves lined the walls, laden with forgotten hymnals, dusty boxes of decorations, and miscellaneous church supplies. In the center of the room stood an old furnace, long dormant. But the mundane scene was horribly corrupted. Pale, phosphorescent fungal growths coated sections of the damp stone walls, pulsing with a faint, internal light. Thick, ropey tendrils of the stuff snaked across the floor and up the support pillars, converging towards the far corner of the basement. The floor there was obscured by a large, quivering mound of the same grayish, fungal material, easily 6 feet across and pulsating with a slow, steady rhythm like a monstrous heart. Multiple nodes, similar to the ones they'd destroyed, but varying in size, were embedded within the mound, throbbing in sync. The infrasound hum was almost deafening. Down here, a physical pressure against Brody's skull. And woven into the grotesque fungal mass, half submerged, were shapes that made Brody's blood run cold, discarded clothing, a pair of eyeglasses. Identical to Mr. Abernathy's, a child's worn teddy bear. Trophies, or remnants of absorption. This wasn't just an anchor, it was a nest, a larder. The deep thrum of the sonic emitter kicked in overhead, the vibrations intensifying in the confined space, shaking dust from the ceiling beams. The central mound immediately reacted, the pulsing quick. Ian became frantic. A collective, high-pitched keening rose from the embedded nodes, echoing painfully off the stone walls. The fungal growths on the walls seemed to writhe, the pale light within flaring erratically. "Martha!" The sigil, Brody shouted, backing towards the stairs, shotgun ready. Martha started cautiously down the steps, Thorne close behind her with a powerful flashlight, illuminating her path. But as she reached the bottom step, aiming the spray towards the thrashing mound, sections of the fungal growth on the walls seemed to detach themselves, resolving into scuttling, multi-limbed shapes similar to the creatures from the cornfield, only smaller, paler, adapted to the darkness. They dropped to the floor and surged towards the intruders, their movements unnervingly fluid. "Creatures!" Miller yelled from the top of the stairs, firing his shotgun down into the basement, the blast echoing like thunder. One of the pale scuttlers disintegrated, but others kept coming. Brody opened fire, aiming low, trying to drive them back from Martha and Thorne. The confined space filled with the roar of shotguns, the screeching of the wounded nest, and the disorienting thrum of the emitter. Thorne dropped his flashlight and fumbled for a heavy wrench he'd tucked into his belt, swinging it wildly at a creature that lunged towards him. Martha, shielded by Brody, continued spraying the sigil of sundering onto the main, pulsating mound, her arms steady despite the chaos. The creature Brody had shot dissolved, but another skittered past him, heading straight for the emitter at the top of the stairs. Miller fired again, missing in the confusion. The creature slammed it. Oh, the device. There was a bright flash, a shower of sparks, and the emitter's deep thrum abruptly died, plunging the basement back into near silence, broken only by the frantic keening of the central mound and the clicking of the remaining scuttlers. Emitters down, Thorn yelled in panic. The effect was immediate. The central mound, no longer battered by the disruptive frequencies, seemed to swell, pulsing with renewed vigor. The remaining scuttlers pressed their attack with increased aggression. Brody fired his last round, taking down another creature, then fumbled to reload, his fingers clumsy with adrenaline. Miller fired again from the stairs. Martha, having completed the sigil, on the main mound, staggered back, dropping the empty spray can. The sigil, even without the accompanying sonic assault, seemed to be having some effect. The main mound began to smoke and bubble, sections darkening and collapsing as before, but much slower now, less violently. It wasn't enough. The keening intensified, changing pitch into something that felt like a summons. Suddenly, a section of the stone wall behind the mound cracked inwards with explosive force, sending debris flying. A much larger entity began to force its way through, amorphous, shifting, composed of roiling shadow and dimly glimpsed, non-Euclidean angles, extruding, glistening, segmented limbs tipped with obsidian claws. It dwarfed the smaller scuttlers, radiating a coldness that sucked the war. MTH from the air and a psychic pressure that made Brody's vision swim. "Get out!" Brody screamed, grabbing Martha's arm and shoving her towards the stairs. "Miller, fall back. Now!" He fired blindly towards the emerging horror as he retreated up the steps, the shotgun pellets seeming to pass through the shifting shadows with little effect. Thorn scrambled up behind him. Miller provided covering fire from the top, then slammed the heavy basement door shut just as a clawed limb lashed out, scoring deep gouges in the wood. They could hear the monstrous sounds from within, the screeching, the tearing, the heavy thuds of a larger entity moving within the confined space. They stumbled out into the cool night air, hearts pounding, lungs burning. They had survived, but barely. They hadn't destroyed the nest completely. The sigil had slowed it, wounded it, but without touch. He sustained sonic assault. It was likely regenerating, recovering. And worse, they had provoked something much larger, something that could tear through solid stone. Brody looked at his depleted ammunition, at Thorn's destroyed emitter, at Martha's empty spray can. Their primary weapon was gone. The nest was still active, possibly enraged. And a major entity was now loose in the church basement. They hadn't contained the nightmare. They had just kicked the hornet's nest, and now the swarm was truly awakening. Failure tasted bitter, cold, and terrifyingly fina. Chapter 5. The Gates of Blackwater. They didn't stop running until they reached the relative sanctuary of the town hall, slamming and barring the heavy oak doors behind them. The sounds from the church, the monstrous roars, the splinty ring wood, the high-pitched keening, faded slightly with distance, but lingered sickeningly in the night air, a promise of imminent, unrestrained horror. Inside, under the flickering emergency lights that cast long, dancing shadows, the four survivors collapsed against the walls, gasping for breath, chests heaving. The smell of gunpowder, sweat, and fear mingled with the ever-present dust and the faint, phantom scent of ozone. Failure clung to them, heavy and cold. Brody leaned his forehead against the cool wood of the door, his shotgun feeling uselessly heavy in his grip. His hands trembled, not just from adrenaline, but from a deep, bone-chilling exhaustion and the stark terror of having faced something so vast and malevolent it could tear through stone. Miller slumped onto a bench, head in his hands, his face pale and didrawn. Thorn paced frantically, running agitated hands through his hair, muttering about interdimensional breaches, mass energy signatures, and the catastrophic failure of containment. Martha. Gable sank wearily onto another bench, her usually stoic expression clouded with a profound grief and weariness that seemed centuries old. She clutched her grimoire to her chest like a shield, its guests whispering secrets they no longer had the means to fully utilize. The emitter, Thorn choked out, his voice cracking. Destroyed. Our only means of actively disrupting them, gone. The sigil slowed it. Martha said, her voice thin but steady. Wounded the nest. But without the scouring frequencies, it wasn't enough. And we angered it. Angered something older, stronger. Brody pushed himself away from the door, forcing himself to think past the immediate terror. All right. Okay. Plan A failed. Miserably. He looked at the faces of his small, battered group. A young Pewdie pushed far beyond his limits. A scientist whose understanding of the universe had been shattered. An old woman armed with forgotten lore. Not exactly an army. The nest in the church is active. Had to ever crawled out of that wall. It's loose in there now. Maybe loose in town soon. He paused, letting the grim reality sink in. And the source, the pit, is still out there, pumping this poison int. Oh, our world. He walked over to the window, carefully peering through a gap in the blinds. Main Street was utterly deserted, swallowed by shadows. The silence outside felt heavier now, charged with anticipation. A faint, rhythmic thrumming from the direction of the pit seemed louder, more insistent, like a monstrous heart beating faster, sensing the impending climax. We can't fight those things head on, Miller said quietly, voicing the thought lingering in Brody's mind. Not the little ones, and definitely not whatever that big thing was. We barely got out of tea. He basement alive. He's right, Thorn agreed, finally stopping his pacing. His eyes had a desperate, feverish gleam. Conventional weapons are minimally effective against the larger manifestations. The nodes were vulnerable to the sonic frequencies and the sigil, but the primary entities, they seem to exist partially outside our physical laws. Attacking the symptoms, the nodes, the nests, it's like trying to cure cancer by removing individual tumors while the source continues to metastasize. He looked towards the west, towards the unseen sinkhole. The source, the pit, the dimensional weakness, the gateway. Whatever it is, that's the target. Brody turned from the window. Go back to the pit? Eris, we saw what happened to Riley. We saw the creatures that came out of the corn. Going back there now, especially without the emitter, it's sussy. Staying here is also suicide, Sheriff. Thorn countered, his voice rising. Just slower, maybe messy, eh? That thing from the church, it won't stay contained for long. The influence from the pit is AC. Celerating, the atmospheric changes, the energy readings, the biological manifestations. It's reaching some kind of crescendo. We either try to close the gate, sever the connection at its source, or we wait here to be consumed or driven mad. Close the gate. Brody scoffed bitterly. Ow! We don't have a weapon anymore. Perhaps we do, Martha said softly, opening her grimoire again. Her finger traced lines in the ancient book. The sigil of sundering, it weakens, repels, disrupts the connection. But the book also speaks of a final seal, a closing ritual. It's far more complex, dangerous, requires immense energy focus, precise timing, and a sacrifice at the locus point. Sacrifice. The word hung in the air, cold and sharp. Brody looked at Martha, then at Thorn, whose eyes widened slightly, a new, terrifying calculation forming. The locus point, the pit itself, Thorn breathed. Energy focus. Martha, the pit is an immense energy source. Those fluctuations, the EM field, it's off the charts. What if we could overload it? Trigger a feedback loop? Use its own energy against it combined with this closing ritual? Overload it how? Miller asked skeptically. Thorn's mind was racing now, piecing together fragments of his science with Martha's lore. The structure beneath, the GPR readings showed those impossible geometries, the fluctuating dimensions. That's like a wound in space-time, bleeding energy. If we could introduce a massive, chaotic energy surge directly into the deepest point we can reach, maybe detonate explosives coupled with Martha perform. This ritual at the epicenter. He trailed off, the sheer insanity of the idea dawning on him. It would be incredibly dangerous. The energy release could be catastrophic, and anyone performing a ritual at the center would be consumed. Martha finished calmly. The ritual requires a life force willingly given, merging with the sealing energies at the moment of closure. A sacrifice to Mendatere. Silence descended again, heavier than before. A suicide mission. A plan relying on detonating explosives inside a reality-warping sinkhole while an old woman performed an ancient ritual requiring her death, all based on fragmented lore and desperate scientific conjecture. It was the stuff of madness. Brody looked around the room again, at the faces of the few people left standing with him against the encroaching cosmic horror. He saw the fear, the exhaustion, but also a glimmer of grim resolve. Orn, stripped of his scientific certainty, was ready to gamble everything on a fusion of physics and magic. Miller, though terrified, stood by his duty. And Martha? Martha seemed resigned, accepting. A fate foreseen perhaps generations ago, recorded in the brittle pages of her family's book. What choice did they have? Wait for the thing in the church to break down the doors. Wait for more nodes to sprout, more neighbors to vanish or snap. Wait for the pit to finally vomit forth whatever sea. Colossal nightmare slumbered in its deepest reaches. Explosives, Brody said, the word tasting like grit. O'Connell's store, the back room. Kept dynamite back there for clearing stumps, blasting rock. Old stock, maybe unstable, but it's all we have. The decision was made, unspoken but absolute. They would make one final, desperate stand, not cowering in the town hall, but taking the fight to the source, to the Hellgate itself. They would try to ill the pit, even if it cost them everything. Gathering their meager remaining supplies, shotguns, dwindling ammunition, flashlights, the dynamite Brody hoped was still viable, and Martha's grimoire felt like preparing for their own funeral. They unbarred the doors and stepped back out into the unnaturally silent, watchful streets of Blackwater Flats. Brody glanced back at the town hall, then towards the dark shape of the church. The BL. Eating hadn't stopped, but maybe, just maybe, they could cauterize the wound at its source. Or die trying. The gates of Blackwater awaited, and the price of admission was steep. Getting the dynamite was a grim, nerve-wracking ordeal. O'Connell's hardware stood silent and dark, a tomb sealed by police tape, and the lingering psychic stain of Pete's violent end. Brody cut the the sound unnaturally loud in the stillness, and they slipped inside, flashlights carving tunnels through the dusty gloom. The wreckage remained untouched, a chaotic monument to Pete's final moment. Of terror. Brody navigated the debris-strewn aisles to the back storeroom, his shotgun held ready, every shadow seeming to writhe with potential threats. The air inside was thick with the smell of dust, stale paint, and something else, that faint, persistent undercurrent of decay. He found the locked metal cabinet where Pete kept the explosives, forcing the lock with a crowbar Miller handed high. Inside, nestled amongst coils of fused wire and blasting caps, were several sticks of old, sweating dynamite. They looked dangerously unstable, the nitroglycerin weeping oily tears onto the wax paw. Per casings. Brody handled them with extreme care, his movements slow and deliberate, acutely aware that a wrong move could end their desperate mission before it even began. He selected several sticks, along with caps and fuse, wrapping them gently in an old canvas tarp he found nearby. Every rustle, every creak of the old building sounded like a gunshot in the suffocating silence. They retreated, back into the dead street, the weight of the volatile explosives adding another layer to the crushing burden of their task. The journey out to the Henderson place, back to the pit, was the longest 10 miles of Brody McLean's life. He drove slowly, avoiding potholes, acutely aware of the unstable cargo beside him on the center seat. Miller followed close behind, his headlights illuminating the empty road and the dark fields rushing past. Thorn sat rigidly in Brody's passenger seat, eyes scanning the darkness. Akka's Ion ally glancing nervously at the tarp-wrapped bundle. Martha sat in the back, clutching her grimoire, her lips moving silently. No one spoke. The world outside the moving vehicle seemed utterly dead, devoid of even insect noises, only the constant, low thrumming from the west vibrating through the car's frame, a subsonic pulse that synced disturbingly with Brody's own anxious heartbeat. The Tyrrell fog clung to the ground in dense patches, swirling across the road like spectral shrouds, forcing Brody to slow down even further. Twice, indistinct shapes darted across the periphery of their lights, low, scuttling things that vanished into the fields before they could be clearly identified. They weren't alone out here. The nightmare was awake and watching. As they approached the final rise, overlooking the Henderson farm, the changes were immediately apparent. The thrumming intensified into a palpable vibration that resonated deep in their chests. The AI are crackled with static electricity, making the hairs on their arms stand on end. A faint, sickly, greenish-purple light pulsed rhythmically from the direction of the pit, illuminating the underside of the roiling fog that now completely obscured the chasm itself, making it look like a giant, infected wound glowing with feverish energy. The metallic, ozone and rot stench was overpowering, burning our nostrils and throats. This wasn't just a hole in the ground anymore. It felt like a living entity, malignant and hyperactive, radiating pure wrongness into the Nebraska night. Brody parked the cruisers a safe distance back, their headlights cutting weakly into the luminous fog. The ground vibrated beneath their feet. Thorne stumbled as he got out, pressing a hand to his TEM. "PLE, the EM field, it's exponentially stronger," he gasped. "Infrasound levels are extreme. It's affecting equilibrium. Be careful." They cautiously approached the edge of the luminous fog bank, the source of the pulsing light and the deafening infrasound concealed within. Brody unwrapped the dynamite, his hands sweating despite unnatural chill radiating from mist. He carefully inserted a blasting cap into one stick and attached a length of fuse, his movements precise despite the disorienting vibrations shaking his body. "The plan," Brody said, shouting to be heard over the thrum, "is simple. Get this as close to the center, as deep as we can manage. Light the fuse. Martha does whatever she has to do. We get the hell back." "How do we get down there?" Miller yelled back, peering into the impenetrable, glowing mist. "We can't even see the edge." Thorne pointed towards a dark shape looming just within the edge of the fog, one of the large, tractor-sized clumps of earth thrown clear during the pit's initial formation. "The ground is unstable and ear the lip. We can't risk rappelling or getting too close. But if we could place the charge near that earth mound when it detonates the shockwave, the debris, it should carry much of the blast down. Ards into the opening. It's crude, but it might be enough to trigger the feedback loop," I theorized, especially if Martha times the ritual precisely. It was a desperate gamble, relying on unpredictable physics and ancient magic. Brody looked at Martha. Her face was serene, almost radiant in the eerie light filtering through the fog, her eyes fixed on the unseen pit. She nodded slowly. "The locus point doesn't have to be the absolute depth. The edge, where the tear meets your world, infused with the sealing energy at the moment of chaotic release. It will suffice, if the intent is pure and the sacrifice is willing." She clutched the grimoire. "I am ready, Sheriff." Brody felt a pang of grief, of protest, but knew there was no other way. He handed the primed dynamite stick to Miller. "You're younger, faster. Get this onto that earth mound. Plant it securely. I'll light the fuse. Thorne, you time it. Martha, get ready." Miller took the dynamite, his face pale but set with determination. He took a deep breath and plunged into the edge of the glowing fog bank, disappearing from sight almost immediately. "Brody, Thorne." and Martha waited, their nerves stretched taut, listening to the deafening thrum, straining to hear any sound from Miller over the roar. Shapes moved within the mist, indistinct but menacing. They grew. Indy trembled more violently. Seconds stretched into an eternity. Then Miller stumbled back out of the fog, gasping, his eyes wide. "Done," he yelled. "It's planted, but things are moving in there. Big things. I saw eyes." Brody didn't waste a second. He pulled out a waterproof match, struck it, the flames sputtering erratically in the charged air, and lunged towards the edge of the fog where Miller indicated he'd plaque. At the charge, he found a fuse, touched the flame to its end. It sputtered, caught, spitting sparks. "Fuse is lit," Brody roared, scrambling back. "Estimate 30 seconds. Thorn, countdown." Martha stepped forward, towards the edge of the pit hidden within the glowing mist. She held her grimoire open, her voice rising, chanting words in a language that grated on the ears, ancient and pal. Refool, cutting through the infrasound thrum. The purple-green light pulsing from the pit intensified, illuminating her figure, turning her into a stark silhouette against the roiling energy. Thorn begged, and shouting the countdown, 25, 24. As Martha chanted, the ground beneath their feet began to heave more violently. Cracks appeared in the earth around them. The fog swirled, revealing glimpses of monstrous shapes moving within the pit. Tentacles, maws lined with impossible teeth, geometries that twisted the eye. Creatures, similar to the ones they'd fought but larger, more grotesque, began to crawl out of the fog bank, drawn by Tish. A ritual, or perhaps summoned to defend the gateway. 15, Thorn yelled, fumbling for his discarded wrench, useless as it was. Miller raised his shotgun, firing into the emerging wave of horrors. Brody fired alongside him, the blasts momentarily riving the creatures back, but more kept coming, an endless tide of segmented limbs and clicking mandibles pouring from the glowing wound in the earth. 10, 9, 8. Martha's chanting reached a crescendo. She raised the grimoire high above her head, her body blazing with an almost unbearable white light that pushed back the sickly glow of the pit. The ground buck. De violently. 5, 4, 3. With a final, resonant word that seemed to shake the very foundations of the world, Martha Gable stepped forward into the luminous fog towards the unseen edge of the pit, her form dissolving into Tish. A blinding white light she now embodied. 2, 1. At the exact moment Thorn shouted 0, two things happened simultaneously. A blinding flash erupted from the spot where Miller had planted the dynamite, followed an instant later by a deafening explosion that seemed to lift the very ground beneath them. And from the heart of the pit, where Martha had vanished, the white light she had become erupted outwards in a colossal, silent wave, Khalidi. In with the shock wave of the dynamite, Brody was thrown backwards, hitting the ground hard, the world dissolving into roaring sound and blinding light. He felt a searing heat, then an absolute, crushing cold, and then nothing. Consciousness returned to Brody McLean in fragments, like surfacing from immense pressure deep underwater. First came the ringing in his ears, a high-pitched whine replacing the monstrous thrumming T. Had dominated their senses for days. Then the sharp pain in his ribs where he'd hit the ground, and the taste of dirt and blood in his mouth. He blinked, his vision swimming. The world was unnatu. Rally silent, the oppressive weight of the pit's presence lifted, replaced by an eerie, hollow quiet. The sickly purple-green glow was gone. The ground beneath him was still cold. He pushed himself up onto his elbows, groaning. Debris, clods of earth, shattered rock, strange blackened fragments that might have been pieces of the creatures, lay scattered everywhere. The air, elled acrid, like spent fireworks mixed with something indescribably alien and burnt. He looked towards where the pit had been. The luminous fog was gone. In its place, the ragged edges of the sinkhole were visible, stark against the first faint hints of dawn painting the eastern sky. But the hole itself, it wasn't a bottomless. abyss anymore. It looked shallower, partially filled with churned earth and shattered rock from the explosion. And at the center, where the light from Martha and the dynamite had converged, the grow. UND seemed fused, melted into a smooth, glassy, obsidian-like surface that reflected the nascent dawn light like a black mirror. It looked like a scar, yes, but a cauterized one, sealed shut. The grew. ND around the immediate rim was blackened and scorched. There was no sign of movement, no creatures, no pulsing nodes. Just silence, devastation, and that unnatural glassy seal where the Hellgate had. Gaped open. Miller. Brody croaked, his voice raw. Thorn. A groan answered him from nearby. He crawled towards the sound, finding Miller lying dazed amongst the debris, clutching his arm, which was bent at an unnatural angle. His face was cut and bleeding. He was alive. Sheriff? Miller mumbled, blinking dazedly. What happened? We did it, son, Brody said, clapping him weakly on the shoulder. I think we actually did it. Another groan, weaker this time. They found Thorn partially buried under a shower of loose earth closer to where the blast's epicenter had been. He was unconscious, bleeding from a head wound, but eating shallowly. Together, Brody and Miller managed to carefully dig him out. They were alive. Battered, broken, traumatized, but alive. The cost, however, was absolute. Martha Gable was gone, consumed by the sealing light. Her sacrifice the terrible price for closing the gate. There was no trace of her, not even the grimoire she had carried. It was as if she, and the ancient knowledge she bore, had been utterly absorbed into the act of mending the tear in reality. As the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the scarred landscape, the silence persisted. The birds, absent for days, began tentatively to sing in the distance. The oppressive atmosphere, lifted, replaced by the clean, cold air of a Nebraska morning. It felt normal. Shockingly, terrifyingly normal after the cosmic horrors they had endured. Getting Thorn and the injured Miller back to the cruisers was a slow, painful process. Brody looked back one last time at the sealed pit, the glassy scar reflecting the morning sun. Was it truly over? Was the ancient evil destroyed, or merely dormant, sealed beneath that obsidian cap, waiting for some future time, some other wound? The silence felt profound, but also watchful. He couldn't shake. The feeling that the land itself remembered, scarred not just physically, but psychically. Blackwater Flats would never truly be the same. The drive back to town was surreal. The few remaining residents who saw their battered cruiser return stared with numb disbelief. The town looked ravaged, not by explosions, but by fear, neglect, and departure. It was a husk, haunted by the memory of the bleeding. Brody got Thorn to the small county clinic 50 miles away. The bridge, miraculously or perhaps coincidentally, was reported structurally sound again by noon, where he eventually regained consciousness, suffering from a severe concussion and temporary amnesia regarding the final moments at the pit. Miller's arm was set. The official story, concocted by Brody, spoke of a freak gas explosion near the Sinkhole during geological instability assessments. It was flimsy, unbelievable, but in the face of the utter weirdness Blackwater Flats had endured, no one questioned it too deeply. They just intended it to be over. The pit remained, a sealed scar on a landscape, eventually cordoned off permanently by the state under vague geological hazard warnings. The Henderson farm was abandoned. Blackwater Flats slowly, Tingley began to breathe again, but the shadows lingered. Too many people were gone. Too many scars remained. The whispers stopped. The nodes dissolved. The strange fungi withered. But the memory, trauma, burrowed deep into the town's collective psyche. Sometimes, locals said, on clear nights, the glassy seal over the pit seemed to gleam with a faint, internal light, and the silence out there felt expectant. And so, the Hellgate of Nebraska was sealed. A victory, perhaps, paid for in blood, sanity, and sacrifice. Sheriff McLean retired a year later, haunted by the things he'd seen, the choices he'd made. Dr. Thorne never fully recovered his memory of the final moments, dedicating his later, more esoteric research to studying anomalous energy fields and the theoretical physics of dimensional weak point. T.S., forever chasing ghosts his conscious mind refused to acknowledge. Deputy Miller transferred out, seeking anonymity in a larger city, the quiet plains holding too many monstrous memories. Blackwater Flats endures, a quiet town on a quiet prairie, bearing its invisible scars. But the question lingers, doesn't it? When you stare into an abyss born of cosmic indifference, and it somehow, impossibly, gets sealed, is the lock truly permanent? Or is it merely waiting for the tumblers to align once more? Some gates, once open, perhaps never truly close. They merely wait. Thank you for joining me, Eli Nightfall, on this journey into the heart of darkness beneath the Nebraska plains. I hope the Hellgate of Nebraska kept you on the edge of your seat, maybe glancing nervously at the shadows in the corner of your room. If you felt that chill, that creeping dread, do me a favor, hit that like button right now. It helps tremendously in battling the algorithms and lets him. You know you want more tales from the abyss. What did you think of Brody's ordeal? What really happened to Martha? Let me know your theories, your reactions, your deepest fears down in the comments section below. I read every single one. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to the Eli Nightfall channel and ring that notification bell. You don't want to miss the next nightmare I have brewing for you. We delve into the darkness regularly here, exploring the fears that lurk just beneath the surface of our fragile reality. Your support keeps these stories coming, keeps the whispers alive. Until next time, try to sleep well. Or perhaps don't. Sometimes it's what you see when you close your eyes that's truly terrifying. Good night.